This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10. I hope you're well. I think I know where we're going today. I don't often know at 10 o'clock in the morning exactly where we're going to be going between now and 1 o'clock. I always reserve the right to change my mind. And we do need to turn our attention at some point to the Israel-Lebanon situation. But I don't know that we have much more to say than what we said yesterday. That's the one area in which I might change my mind. We'll try and get a good guest on for that later in the programme. But I don't know at this point in proceedings whether or not I'm minded to do it as a phone-in. I am minded to do the proposals regarding women's prisons. I sometimes get a little bit of a surprise when I think that this is something we've never talked about before. You think of all the conversations we've had, and I hope we're not as guilty as some people of having the same conversations every day. But the difference between a woman being sent to jail and a man being sent to jail feeds into quite a lot of issues, doesn't it? And the idea that one should go more than the other is something that we'll have a look at a little later in the programme. And then something I am enduringly fascinated by, and this probably does lead us open to the accusation of having the same conversation every day, but I haven't nailed it yet, or rather we haven't nailed it yet, because I think you bear at least 48% of the responsibility for anything that goes wrong on this programme. And it's something that Keir Starmer touched on yesterday in the context of immigration and young people who are already in this country, young people who were born here or young people who live here. And this idea that there is an army of young people not just waiting for a break, not doing whatever it is that they want to be doing, and somehow capable of filling all the holes in our workforce that currently get filled by foreign-born people. We haven't got to it yet. There's another story about the number of people who simply don't turn up on their first day of a new job. I've got a mate who's a hairdresser, has his own salon as a hairdresser, and the stories he tells me about people coming in absolutely adamant it's all their dreams come true to be a hairdresser. It's all they've ever wanted is to be a hairdresser, like their mum before them and their gran and their granddad and oh, please give me a chance. And then like first day in, they disappear. They go for their lunch break on day one and they don't come back. I don't know if we can knit all of those stories together, but we can certainly try. But I'm going to begin with something that does hark back to conversations that we've had in the past. There's two things I can think of immediately that are echoing this morning. The first is, and again, this is something that you may be, if you're a relatively recent arrival at this spot on your radio dial, you may be a little bit surprised to learn that I used to be very much of the view that if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. I still lean in that direction on some issues, but if I learn anything from the rise of politicians like Suella Braverman and Priti Patel to high office in this country, I learned that you can never take freedoms for granted. You can never take your freedom to protest. You can never take your freedom of speech. You can never take your freedoms for granted, even in a liberal democracy. I mean, just look across the Atlantic. Some of the stuff that Project 2025 would involve Donald Trump enacting in the event of him getting back into the White House. The notion that just because you live in a liberal democracy today, you will be living in a liberal democracy tomorrow is incredibly naive. If we made a list of the naivest things we've ever thought, I remember that Tony Benn quote about never winning anything. And I used to think, oh, the daft old commie. Don't at me. I know that's an unfair thing to think, but these I'm sharing with you my private thoughts. So Tony Benn talked about you never win anything forever. It's a constant war of attrition, and you might think that you've won, but then you need to push back, and the other side will push back, and you need to push back on the side of freedom and liberalism. And of course, the repeal of Roe versus Wade in America is probably the best ever example of that. I was a schoolboy debater. The abortion debate was one of the absolute hardy perennials. And by the time I'd been sitting in this chair for 10 years, I thought it had died as a debate. I actually thought it was over. You then have the leader of the free world essentially presiding over the repeal of sexual autonomy, bodily autonomy, forgive me, for women in the United States of America, with already precisely the consequences you might have expected. So even those victories that feel epochal and permanent are not. That's why you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. They change what you should fear. That's why it's a stupid philosophy. They change what you should, what you fear. You've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear if you're pregnant. But if they outlaw abortion, then you've got something to hide because you've got something to fear, which is being forced to go through with the pregnancy you don't want. This is not a phone-in about abortion. Put your phone down. And that's why I find myself a little bit wary when I look at a story and think to myself, well, maybe this is the exception that proves the rule. Maybe this is one of those things where if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The possibility that if you are a benefit fraudster, you should actually have your bank account examined by the authorities. You should not be able to keep your financial arrangements secret. You should be essentially exposed to deeper scrutiny. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. £7.3 billion was the figure that the Department for Work and Pensions put on benefit fraud last year alone. And they said that COVID had enhanced the public's growing willingness to commit fraud. I mean, you look at some of the conservative donors who trousered enormous sums of money during the COVID contracts roller coaster, and you probably would, if you were of a slightly humbler background, find yourself thinking, well, I'll have a bit of that. Why should I be so careful about dotting the I's and crossing the T's when you've got people in the House of Lords standing accused of all sorts of things? But it doesn't excuse it. It's still wrong. Universal credit fraud, sausages. See how easy it is to say the wrong word? Public universal credit sausages. I'm slightly uneasy with taking the mickey out of Keir Starmer too much because he mistook, if you missed this story, he said sausages instead of hostages. And I don't know how much laughter you can do when it's in the context of the hostages that are still being held in Gaza. But we can certainly poke a little bit of fun in his direction, largely by trying to distract from the fact that I just misspoke in a relatively trivial way by pointing out that his misspeak, his swapping of the word sausages for hostages is probably the most unfortunate you could imagine. It's hard to think of a more serious word in a more serious context than hostages still being held by Hamas, and it's hard to think of a sillier word with which you could replace such a serious word than sausages. If this was a slightly different radio station broadcasting to a slightly different audience, I might do a little bit of what's your favourite sausage, but that would be the worst kind of radio. Worst? No? Just me then. So the DWP finds that benefit fraud is on the rise and is high. The Labour government has brought back what the Guardian elects to call this morning a potential snoopers charter. So you would allow welfare officials to request information from claimants' bank accounts. That's question number one. I think I'm supremely comfortable with that. I have got a particular animus for benefit fraudsters for two reasons. The first is obvious. It's theft, and you're stealing from me. You're stealing from everybody. And the second is that it allows the usual suspects to portray everybody on welfare as potentially swinging the lead, everybody in receipt of a state benefit, everybody availing themselves of the safety net that we have all paid and will all pay and continue to pay to knit for those moments when our neighbours, our friends, our family members, our colleagues, and of course complete strangers need to actually be held up by society, by each other, the safety net that the welfare state represents. One of the most beautiful creations in the history, I would argue, of politics. But of course, people who hate empathy, generosity, people who hate compassion, people who hate sharing. I always think you can tell a lot about somebody. You know, when you come across someone's politics and you find it a little pungent, you know that when they were kids, they hated sharing. They're the kind of kids that would eat a whole packet of biscuits. That might be a boarding school thing, rather than actually divvy a few around the dormitory after lights out. You know that they hated sharing. And they are now the kind of people that hate the welfare state because it helps people that need help and they don't think they will ever need help. So, you know, coming soon to a so-called think tank near you. And that's what intrigues me about this story is why, when I'm so clear-eyed about the evilness of that rhetoric, am I so comfortable with the idea of a so-called snooper's charter? If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. So this is question number one. Is benefit fraud and the privacy of your own bank account one area where you can actually apply the if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear rule without either opening the door to future oppression and repression? In other words, thin end of the wedgism. Well, if you let them look at your bank accounts today, for benefit fraud, what are they going to be looking for tomorrow? That all sounds a little bit GBBs to be worrying about that kind of thing. But you're more than welcome to tell me, 0345 6060973. And the second one is a little bit more personal. Who would dob someone in? Personally, we were talking about this upstairs before the show started, and it escalated pretty quickly, as I mentioned just before Nick clocked off. It escalated pretty quickly from, well, I'd probably grass on my sister-in-law because I really don't like her. She's always banging on about her holidays, and she's always in the nail bar. And I know that she's working cash in hand while also claiming, or I know she's doing benefit fraud. And then another colleague started talking about whether or not you'd dob in your own mother if you knew that they'd committed a murder. I can't tell you whose producer said they wouldn't. They just try and sit her down and encourage her to hand herself in. So, and then, quite mild-mannered young colleagues came out with phrases like snitches get stitches. People who I wouldn't ordinarily associate with. And it's a very widespread view, isn't it, that you should never grass anybody up, unless it's a sort of act of petty revenge, in which case we're all right about it. Should never tell anybody about somebody else's malfeasance or somebody else's misdeeds. And that's why I wonder whether it works. I have a theory, which is exactly 18 minutes old. I have a theory that if you opened up a phone line, and these phone lines exist, I bet it's the same people ringing in all the time. I bet it's the same old busybodies ringing in all the time to try and get someone they don't like into trouble, or just sticking their nose into other people's business. And it shouldn't be. So why do we have such a psychological problem with the idea of why all the language is unhelpful? I'm about to say grassing up. That's a negative. No one wants to be a grass. I'm about to say snitching. That's a negative. Snitches get stitches. Informing makes you think of, I don't know, the Vichy regime in France or something like that. Or people who were dobbing in the French resistance. Dobbing in isn't helpful either. What is there even a positive word for it? Doing my civic duty as a patriot. As a law-abiding patriot, doing my civic duty by pointing out the misdemeanors of people that are robbing the rest of us blind. Why do all the words to describe that sound like I'm the wrong un? Sound like I'm the baddie? I'm the supergrass? I'm the snitch? I'm the dobberiner? I can't think of what the correct word would be. So, is this one area where if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear? 0345 6060973. It's not really whistleblowing, Mike, although that's a nicer word, isn't it? Whistleblowing. It's not really whistleblowing because it's an individual. I always think of whistleblowing as being a sort of institutional calling out. But why don't we do it more? That's not the question I was going to ask. The question I was going to ask was whether or not you've done it. So I'll ask that as well. But why don't we do it more? Why are we so uncomfortable? And of course, please ring me and tell me that you're not. Dirty Gertie at number 30 has been taking the mickey for years, and you can't believe that the DWP haven't been around to feel her collar, given that you phone them every single Tuesday when you get in from the pub, every day. Oh, and by the way, I don't know whether you've noticed this, but guess what? They're not closing the pubs early. Incredible. There's a comment piece in the Telegraph today based upon the idea that they are. And I mentioned to you yesterday, even in the Daily Telegraph, if you read to the end of the absolute nonsense about the Labour government being prepared to close pubs early, even in the articles people were using to lie to you, it stated that they were definitely not going to be closing the pubs early. It's one of the maddest moments of media manipulation or media dishonesty that I can remember seeing. But the pubs will not be closing early, which means you probably would have to clock off a little early to get on the hotline to the DWP to grass up or snitch on or dob in Dirty Gertie at number 30, who's been rinsing the taxpayer for years. So is it fair enough for the government to have a butcher's at all of our bank accounts in pursuit of benefit fraud? 0345 606 0973. Why do we feel so wary of telling tales on a benefit fraudster? And of course, if you don't feel wary, what happens when you do? Why did you? When did you? What did you do? 0345 6060 973. It's 10:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 10. Sometimes my memory does funny things. I don't mean in a bad way. I mean in a good way. I remembered this story, but it's 8 years old, and it found that 85% of calls to the DWP's benefit cheat hotline when the Tories had it in place were closed due to lack of evidence, which kind of plays into my point about it being a spiteful thing to do, and often unevidenced. 85% of cases. This is people accusing friends, family, neighbours of welfare fraud 1 million times since 2010, but 85% of them closed due to a lack of evidence. How do we feel about it? And how do we feel about the government having the right to look at everybody's bank account in pursuit of problems, in pursuit of offences, misdemeanours? And why, psychologically, does it feel like a bad thing to do? When it shouldn't. It's quite a patriotic, it's quite a civic duty almost. Alison's in Falkirk. Alison, what would you like to say?
Yeah, what I'd like to say is I'm deeply uncomfortable with the intrusiveness of allowing people to investigate other people's bank accounts. My personal lived experience is that my daughter recently gave up work and became a full-time carer for my profoundly disabled grandson. So she's in receipt of benefits. I recently tried to raise money to buy him an adapted trike, which we successfully did.
Well done.
However, I did that through GoFundMe rather than going through the charities. I gave up on the charities that supply bikes when I tried to fill in the form. And one of the questions on the form, and this was the killer for me, was, how much per month do you spend on clothes?
Yes.
Now, why is it anybody's business why my lovely daughter, caring for a profoundly disabled boy, has to justify buying clothes?
I think you are asking that in a rhetorical sense, so I hope you won't be offended if I try to answer it.
Okay, have a go.
Well, because they have finite amounts of funds and they want to ensure that they go to the places where they are most needed.
Yes, I understood.
So if you were spending $5,000 a month on clothes, then the charity would conclude that you could spend $2,000 a month on clothes and $3,000 a month on the stuff that you've applied to the charity for. No? Have I misunderstood something there?
No, that's right. But are we going to be asking the same questions of everybody who's in receipt of benefits?
Well, that's
you're not entitled.
Yeah, that's the you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent fear. If I tell you, the Department of Work and Pensions said that the staff will be trained to the highest standards on the appropriate use of any new powers, and we will introduce new oversight and reporting mechanisms to monitor these new powers. You'll be able to request information from claimants' bank accounts, but you won't have access to people's bank accounts, and nothing that you receive in terms of personal information would be shared with any third party. So, I mean, in many ways, it's the phone-in host's worst enemy, that it becomes bogged down in nuance and detail when we just want to have a big ding-dong. But perhaps the nuance and the detail would be a comfort to you.
I think so. If the system is already so biased about meeting the needs of vulnerable people.
Yes, that's very true.
I phoned you before I phoned you and told you about my daughter who had to borrow money from me, and she was so ashamed and embarrassed that the money coming in from her husband's new job hadn't matched up.
I remember, and,
Yes.
and that
Yes.
stigma and that shame is something that is just a reality. You know, there's no point sitting here and saying, well, she shouldn't feel like that. That's just the way that people do feel. And I think that you know, you've reminded me, Alison, of something that really I find very poignant, actually, when people ring me. And it's often people who weren't born here as well, who feel the need to stress before making a point, given whatever the subject may be. But if it's relevant to the subject we're discussing, people often say to me, I've never claimed a penny in benefits. I've never claimed a penny in benefits. As if I care. As if the very act of doing so is a negative, rather than a basic right of citizens of this country. I remember when Dad got made redundant by the Daily Telegraph at the end of the 1980s, and he told me he was going to go down the job centre. I was mortified. You can't do that, Dad. I mean, for a start, I knew roughly what his redundancy payout was. So, and he said, "No, I'm going to go. I want to register as unemployed. I want to get the help that I am due. Not really, in his case, the financial help, but the access to. You know, he hadn't made a CV for 30 years, and yet, for me, as someone who I don't think at that stage I'd not worked anywhere except the brasserie. Oh, and the 2 weeks on the building site in Doncaster that I never mention on the show. I had a sense of stigma on my dad's behalf, and that was in 1990. So it's only got worse since then, hasn't it? I think. Alison, thank you. It's a perfect start because you remind us that this is a little bit more complicated than the headlines allow. Jack's in Swindon. Jack, what would you like to say?
Hello there, James. Please forgive me, I'm a little bit nervous. First time caller.
It's only me, Jack. It's only me.
I've got a sort of personal experience with this myself.
Yeah.
I say myself, it's actually my brother. So he met someone a year ago. They've been dating. They want to move in together. Now, the problem is that she works, he doesn't.
Right.
He has 2 kids that he's looking after. He's in receipt of universal credit and housing benefit. They want to move in together, but to do so, they would have to declare her moving in with him. And by doing so, she would lose. He would lose his universal credit and his housing benefit.
Yeah.
And the onus would then fall on her, who is on, a mediocre sort of wage, wouldn't be able to support, herself, him, and the 2 children. Putting food on the table, paying rent, paying the council tax, paying the bills. And I feel that fraud in this instance is only called fraud because they give it that name. They set the bar. And if there was
in a way, all fraud is a consequence of where the bar has been set. I think what you're really saying is that this particular bar feels a little unfair or a little unjust.
I mean, in this instance, would it not be fair to say, well, okay, it's a sort of means-tested benefit. We'd have a look at what his income was, what her income was, find the happy medium, what the sort of middle ground was. So, okay, you can afford to pay X amount of £100 per month. We'll take that from your benefits instead and allow you to both live together.
So is it all or nothing? If he moves in with her, he gets nothing? And
that's exactly what it is.
So she earns just enough.
Universal credit.
Universal credit looks at your part. So hang on, let me just clarify this because a lot of people listening won't be as clued up as you are. Universal credit classifies a couple, very much so, looks at 2 people and determines whether either of them are due anything based upon what the other one is earning. And so she earns just enough to ensure that he would get nothing.
Sort of, but it's actually worse than that because it doesn't matter how much she is earning. What they would say is you now have someone that you want to move into your property and put onto the tenancy agreement.
Oh, it's that way. She's moving in with him.
She's moving in with him.
Sorry, I got that
and
the
in
wrong
order
way
to
around.
do that, they have to then...
And she earns, which means he loses the right to...
Exactly. And basically the onus falls down on her to then support him, his 2 children, run the household, pay the bills, pay the council tax, put food on the table, and it seems really, really unjust. And I think that...
a lot of people listening will think it doesn't sound unjust. They'll wonder why he isn't working for a start. And, I'd need to ask you that question because we've gone into quite a specific case, haven't we?
He is a stay-at-home father to 2 severely autistic children.
Yeah, and the state currently supports him in doing that. And if his partner moved in, if his girlfriend moved in, the state no longer would.
Exactly that.
Yeah, that does sound unfair to me. That does sound
and
unfair.
And that's why
to me.
say I think if there was a system where there was to sort of look at, what her sort of monthly or annual income was, and say, okay, we can offset that against, what it is that we pay you.
No, I mean, again,
it make up the difference.
It's a very specific case, but I think you've put your brother's cause very powerfully, very compassionately, and the idea. I don't know whether this would be relevant, requesting information from claimants' bank accounts, but that would be very much the sort of space in which they did it. They'd have a look at the girlfriend's bank account and say, well, sorry, you're at this address now, which means you're not getting these payments and these payouts. It doesn't feel like fraud. Now I have to apologise for the point I made about the bars, because you've explained it so well. That saying, well, fraud is always about where the bar is, that does feel like a slightly arbitrary and rather unfair imposition. And that's the whole point about if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. None of us are going to agree forever on every subject about what's unfair and what isn't. But there'll come a point where almost all of us would agree that something was unfair. The totalitarian rage. Well, no, that's not true either, is it? Because they often enjoy support from elements of the citizenry that don't think they'll ever be affected by the bad stuff. But that sounds unfair. And yet that is precisely the sort of situation that would be blown up by the so-called Snoopers Charter. And they have got something to hide, but they've also got something to fear. And they probably shouldn't have to hide it or fear it in a fair there you go. I told you it was nuanced. 10:31 is the time. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:34. Why this focus on the poor? Why don't we also take action against the rich? Asks this text. Why are you talking about this and not talking about tax avoidance or tax evasion by the super wealthy? It's not either or. My reserves of patience are more capacious in 2024 than they have been at any other point in my life. I find the universe a warm, welcoming and wonderful place. But if I ever feel a little prick of impatience, it is with people who catch one topic on the show and presume that it's all we ever talk about. Why are you talking about this and not talking about that? We talk about roughly 14 things a week for about, 45 weeks of the year? I can't remember how much holiday I take. I always get confused about Christmas. 45 or 46 weeks of the year, 14 topics a week, because you can't include Miss Drought. What's that, Keith? What's 46 times 14? I'll tell you what it is. It's a lot of topics. And sometimes we come back to similar territory. Sometimes we repeat ourselves because we find the subject so fascinating. But the idea that because I'm talking about something announced yesterday at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool at 10:36 today means that I never ever talk about the thing that you think I should be talking about, even though these texts are phrased in quite a polite fashion. I'm afraid they are very much destined for Idiot's Corner if it continues in this fashion. In fact, to go full school teacher on you, if you send me any more messages saying, why aren't you talking about this? I will send you straight to Idiot's Corner, because you don't know what I'm going to talk about next. You don't know what I talked about yesterday. You don't know what I talked about 10 minutes ago if you've just turned your radio. So that is now, as of now, that's Idiot's Corner territory. Why aren't you talking about that? And also, they are. You silly old sausage. I use that word deliberately, not accidentally. You have a very serious policy directed at the 74,000 people who claimed non-dom status in this country in the most recently available year. The Labour Party has announced its plans to scrap that tax status completely. Whether or not it ends up raising more money for the NHS and other public services remains to be seen, but it's very clear attempt to address precisely the thing that you say they're not addressing. I would argue that the VAT on school fees is also a policy directed at the people who have measurably and obviously got a lot more than the average person in this country has got. I think the average income is less than the average annual cost of sending a child to private school. And yet, of course, next time we get around to doing that on the programme, we'll get the calls from people saying, well, I work very hard to send my child to private school, as if the person over the road who works very hard just to keep their children fed and clothed is somehow spending their life watching daytime television and twiddling their thumbs. Anyway, why aren't you talking more about Idiot's Corner? That's a very good point, and you can go in it. Back to benefits. Snoopers charters, grassing up, snitches get stitches, and the psychological, I'll nudge you along to this a bit if we can. The psychological obstacle to doing something that objectively is the right thing to do? Where does that come from? Is it school? I could still tell you the names of the lads at school who you realise a little bit too late sometimes are telling teachers what you're up to. You know? You probably still haven't forgiven them because it's an us and them mentality, and then people get made monitors or prefects, and you suddenly realise it's not us and them, is it? It's 4 legs good, 2 legs better territory. Claire's in Dorchester. Claire, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello, Claire.
About 20 years ago, I claimed housing benefit as it was then.
Yes.
I was asked to provide my bank statement. Not a problem, I thought. Happy to do so. Think it's only right that we should, be honest. So, provided my bank statement.
To the DWP?
To the local authority.
Yeah.
Who, it wasn't DWP then, it was just the local council.
Right.
Provided them without fear because I had nothing to hide.
Yeah.
I then got a phone call saying, we've been through your bank statements. You can't claim housing benefit because you spend far too much on luxuries.
Okay.
And I said, could you explain? And they stated that my daughter had her birthday the week before, and I had bought all her friends for a sleepover pizza.
Mm.
And they told me I had spent far too much money on pizza, and that if I stopped spending on luxuries,
you'd be able to pay your rent. How much had you spent on pizza?
Oh, it was probably about £20-30.
And that, it wasn't a weekly occurrence. It was an annual occurrence.
No,
it was a birthday treat.
I just got divorced. I promised my daughter a party. I couldn't afford the all-out party with all her friends, so she had 5 or 6 friends round for a pizza and a sleepover. So it wasn't massive, and it was a one-off. But they only asked for 3 months' bank statements. So in that 3 months, they picked up on absolutely every luxury I'd ever spent money on.
Well, gosh. Well, hang on. So this became a regular occurrence?
No, that was just them checking on me.
Did you lose the housing benefit as a consequence?
I did, and I had to go to an appeal where I won the appeal.
Just promise me, Claire, just for this one pizza delivery?
Yes.
And you won on appeal. So, what have we got here? A problem with the system? Proof that if you've got nothing to hide, you have got something to fear? Or, and I want to use this word very carefully because I nearly let myself down a bit there with an Anglo-Saxonism, or that this character that you encountered was just the mother or father of all Jobsworths, was just a proverbial pain in the
I put it down
places.
to a Jobsworth, I have to say.
I do too.
Because I think you have to. But it has now put me off. If I was ever in the situation again, I would think twice about applying.
Even though the system has changed. There's this. It wouldn't. I think self-employed people get quite a lot of scrutiny already. But the idea that everybody in receipt of a benefit, well, that's what are they going to be looking for if they want to have a look at?
They're going to be looking at your finances. Okay, obviously big money coming in that you shouldn't have. That's obvious, and I would expect that, and I would want them to do that.
Yes. Not this.
You have to accept if you're going to claim there is an element of it's public funds and there has to be transparency.
That's beautifully put. But But where's the line? And this is fascinating because so let's play a game, right? So you know that was the only delivery of pizza of that size that you had that year.
Yeah.
Right. What if it was every month? Would it have been right to come after you then?
I think for small amounts like that, I think you have to sort of say, that's not a massive amount of money.
No, fine. Question answered. Every week.
Every week? No, because people can spend their money how they want.
All right, every day.
No, then I would be querying
you
it.
See? So it's about where the bar is, isn't it?
It is. It is where the bar is, but there has to be some freedom to live.
I completely agree with you. And crikey, that's the problem. That's precise. God, the callers are much better than me today. I don't say that's true every day. But every call is changing this story, aren't they? In fact, I got just a message there a minute ago saying my apologies, which I presume was because you didn't realise that this was a lot more nuanced than it would ordinarily be presented. So everyone agrees the bar should be somewhere. We've spoken to the fellow whose brother looks after his severely autistic children as a single parent, and he's going to be potentially penalised by this system, by where the bar is. Claire points out perfectly that we don't think you should be able to order from your dinner from Domino's every night if you're in receipt of any state benefits, but once a year is absolutely fine. So that's the point. What is it that you should fear? Even if you think you've got nothing to hide, it might turn out that you do. 10:43 is the time. Thank you, Claire. Peter is in Stockport. Peter, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I'm quite new to claiming benefits, so it's been about three months now.
Yeah.
Back to my job to care for my dad.
Oh, crikey. I'm sorry to hear that.
These things happen, you know. You
They
just
do.
have to make your choices.
Yeah.
Now, the form that you're filling online is really detailed. It goes into all the bank accounts, all the numbers that you need, asks you how much cash you've got, and I just assume they already checked all that information themselves
Right.
when you give it over to them. So I'm not surprised that I'm surprised that it's actually an issue. I think the bit that gets to me is I moved back home 10 years ago to save for a deposit for a house,
Yeah.
and now I'm having to eat into my dreams of ever getting on the property ladder because the amount of money that you get from benefits just doesn't really cut it. £80 a week as a carer.
That's your carer's allowance. That's the
That's
full.
the carer's allowance, but because I had the savings, universal credit is, I think it's £6,000 is free. And I know it sounds like, he's got loads of money.
£6,000.
Well, that's the, you can get,
If you've got savings down £6,000 or above, you don't get anything from universal credit.
No, I think it's up to £16,000. So
Right.
the first £6,000 they don't take anything off. And
Got
then
it.
for every 250 after that, you take off £4 a week. But my universal credit on top of the carer's allowance comes to £60 this month. So we're not talking big figures. And I am using my savings up, but by the time they're gone, I don't know what I'm going to be able to do. And, like I say, my doing all the right things, moving back home, saving £2,000 a year to try and save for a deposit, it's gone now.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, in some ways, the conversation you might be expecting to have with a Labour government in power would be about what they can do to help people who aren't getting enough support from the state. And I think that most of us would put carers at the very, very top of that list. And that was absent, I think, from speeches at conference this week.
I don't know. I really don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, I'm trying to keep my hand in, keeping my skills. I was working in data science and still keep my skills up to scratch. If looking for a job when I do go back, or whether I retrain and stuff.
But at the moment, you've prioritised your dad over your future, haven't you? And that's a very.
I know it sounds really silly. I'm going off a little bit of topic here, but I previously dated somebody who worked as a carer.
Oh yeah.
And I was just a bit disgusted with her attitude. Didn't last long, I'll tell you that. But,
with her attitude?
Yeah, I mean, when she'd be working, she'd be texting me, taking photographs of the staff and making jokes and stuff, and they had dementia. And she said, well, they're not going to mind. They're not going to remember.
I see what you mean. And that put you off the idea of having someone else look after your dad?
Totally.
Oh, mate, I don't think you've gone off topic at all. I thought you might be doing for a minute there where you were talking about your love life, but that makes perfect sense. And she's not representative of the entire profession, as I know you know, but the idea that you don't want your dad to be looked after by someone who would not treat him with dignity has prompted you to make decisions that almost everybody listening would be quite humbled by. So it's a really admirable thing that you've done there, and I naively think that that's the sort of decision, the sort of choice that should be supported by the state, not essentially one that sees you penalised. It's 10:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:50 is the time. The world is split between those who deny 10 deserving people help in order to block one undeserving person, and those who'd rather help 10 who don't need it than deny help to the one who does. In politics, writes No Hostages on X, on Twitter, the group you prioritise speaks volumes. I like that. And it's a little simplistic, but I think the premise holds true. In the finest tradition of this programme, I asked my crack team of colleagues yesterday to keep an eye on the Amazon chart with regard to The Queen and I by Sue Townsend, because I want to see what effect me telling you that it was absolutely brilliant when we were having a conversation about the £500 million a year that the royal family reportedly costs us. I wanted to see what effect we had on it in the chart, but in the finest traditions of this programme, no one did a blessed thing about it. I'd note today that it's at number 414, which I'm supremely confident it wasn't yesterday. But I don't know how much it has increased by. I do know this from Patrick. You'll never guess what, James, he writes. I ordered a used copy. Can we say second-hand, please, Patrick? Used sounds a little bit indecent, doesn't it? A used copy of a... Ugh. I ordered a second-hand copy of Sue Townsend's Queen and I yesterday after you mentioned it. And Amazon have just cancelled the order. That's the first time this has ever happened to me. Also, the price for new copies has gone up by £3 from when I looked yesterday. Well, it's pretty obvious what's happened. You've been Oasised, haven't you? So whoever was getting ready to send you the second-hand copy of The Queen and I noted that the price had gone up by quite a lot as a direct consequence of it being recommended on this programme, and therefore they've cancelled your transaction and sold it instead to someone who was prepared to pay more. I think that's exactly what's happened, isn't it? You have been Oasised, mate. That's just not fair. Do you know what I'm going to do, Patrick? I'll tell you what. I'll have a little look around at home and see if I've got a copy knocking around. And in which case, you can have mine for the new price. Steph, is it? No, she's not. We'll go to Steph shortly. Before that, we'll go to Henry Riley, who is in Liverpool and who has been watching Wes Streeting's speech to the Labour Party conference. Henry, before we get into the grown-up stuff, I without giving too much away, I was at an event the other night and David Cameron turned up.
Oh.
Have David Cameron and Wes Streeting got the shiniest faces in the history of British politics?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, you're right. They both do, actually.
It's extraordinary. They look painted.
Very good skin Wes Streeting has as well.
Glorious
right.
skin. Glorious. Anyway, how was his speech?
It was
Never mind the skin. How was his speech?
No, it was very good. He had a slightly croaky voice, which you could hear throughout. I think, as is often the case at these events, he has been credited with going to the most parties at conference this year. Him and Pat McFadden, I think, hold the record. So it's a very sort of social event. I imagine he's done a lot of talking, so it's understandable that on the last day he's slightly losing his voice. But this was a very serious speech with a very serious message from the Health Secretary. And you'll recall, James, if you look this morning, he's received a lot of flack, Wes Streeting. The BBC running a story that senior figures within the NHS, senior sources, are criticising him for his constant use of the word broken when talking about the NHS. Now, they don't doubt there are problems, but the reporting is that some within the health service believe that the claims go too far, and actually if people believe it's broken, they will be reluctant to get treatment. And actually, Wes Streeting completely doubled down in his speech, saying the NHS is broken.
It's not just that the Tories didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. They doused the house in petrol, left the gas on, and COVID just lit the match. And when you put protecting the reputation of the NHS above protecting patients, you're not helping the NHS, you're killing it with kindness. So I say respectfully, but unequivocally, I won't back down. The NHS is broken, but it's not beaten, and together we will turn it around.
Wes Streeting, which was greeted by party activists, James, as you'd imagine very well. There is still a lot of people here, despite the fact the boss has gone. Keir Starmer is in New York at the UN. There are still a lot of party activists who are milling around. We've just had a protest from Unite the Union ahead of their vote on the winter fuel payment cut. In terms of the news line of this speech, the main sort of thrust of it and headline was this idea of sending crack teams, as he put it, Formula One style sort of operations, whereby you have a concentrated number of surgeons in a hospital in a particular area, whereby they have a high level of people who are sick, who are off work, and they try and get them obviously back to health and therefore eventually back into the workplace. That was something that was explained by Wes Streeting.
We're sending crack teams of top clinicians to hospitals across the country to roll out reforms developed by surgeons to treat more patients and cut waiting lists. And I can announce today that the first 20 hospitals targeted by these teams will be in areas with the highest numbers of people off work sick. We will take the best of the NHS to the rest of the NHS, get sick Brits back to health and back to work.
And, of course, this is a tough brief, James. As you know, there is a huge amount to do with the NHS. We've just had the report from Lord Darcy, the surgeon, member of the House of Lords, laying out some of the problems that the service is facing. Wes Streeting, in no doubt, he told the conference, told delegates that he will face loud opposition, but that he will do what it takes to finally fix the NHS.
It will take time, and it won't be easy. We will have to fight loud opposition, cynicism and vested interests. But conference, bring it on. It's up to us to prove that politics can be a force for good again.
So the main thing to take away, James, lastly, the NHS is broken. That's the point made by Wes Streeting, reiterating it again today in spite of some circles criticising him, and that the NHS is letting people down. Give him time and he will try and fix it.
That's a really interesting speech, actually, and that notion of doubling down is fascinating. I wonder whether Wes Streeting believes that these sources and obviously I'm in a bit of a tricky position here, having written a book called How They Broke Britain. I can hardly criticise other people for using the word broken in describing key elements of Britain that actually appear in the book. But I wonder if Wes Streeting thinks his fight here is with management rather than medics, and that the consensus among medics is that things are pretty bloody dire.
I think that's a really good point. And these figures that are quoted are hospital leaders, for example, senior figures within hospital. And you're right, they, of course, undoubtedly have a difficult job, and not for a moment saying they don't. But, of course, with regards to people on the front line, Wes Streeting was quoting people who work within the ambulance service. He was also, crucially, quoting patients. He thinks he's speaking, as you say, James, for the medics, for the people who are working on the ground. But also, crucially, he wants to be the voice of patients.
And of course, it falls to us to remind everybody to go to the doctor or to seek an appointment or to consult the NHS if you think there's something wrong with you, because the fear that this rhetoric might put people off is probably unfounded, but it nonetheless can be addressed. Henry Riley, safe journey home. What are you doing? Getting the train? Getting the National Express?
Yeah, no, we splashed out on the train. Yeah, I know. Golden ticket for me. I know, for me this year. Crikey. But going on the train. I know, I'm very pleased with that, actually. It saves me a walk. So getting the train at some point later this afternoon after been enjoying myself, been to a lot of events. It's been great fun.
Lovely. First class, is it?
Oh, God, no. No, I don't even think I'd have
BBC.
I haven't got a reserved seat.
It's coming up to 10:59. Henry Riley, always a pleasure. Many thanks indeed. I guess, apart from management's Conservative politicians who've presided over the NHS for the last 14 years and client journalists who've kind of tickled their tummy while they did so, most people would probably recognise Wes Streeting's description of the NHS as having been broken, but it may be something that we return to later this week. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, currently addressing Labour conference. We may catch up with some of the stuff that she said, but I want to return your attention to speeches that were made yesterday. And I don't think, I could be wrong, and you've got a much better memory than I have, I don't think we've ever looked specifically at the issue of women in prisons and the suggestion that many more of them than men, a much bigger proportion of them than men, should not be in prison at all. I find this fascinating and also, at first glance, a little bit confusing. And you know what I do when I find something fascinating and confusing, don't you? Oh yes, I ask you.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. Since the dwindling of unhinged headlines, a very fondly regarded feature on the programme where we would find a headline, usually in the Daily Telegraph comment pages, that was completely bonkers. I mean, bonkers to the point of incredulity, but bonkers to the point of making Nadine Dorries look like, I don't know, Jane Austen. The Twitter accounts of some Conservative politicians have stepped into the breach for me. One of them is Neil O'Brien, Uncle Neil. No, he's no relation. I can't say anything on the radio these days. Conservative MP for Harborough, Oadby and Wigston, who has responded to a speech by the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, or the Prisons Minister. No, the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, by prison isn't working for women by claiming that it's pure ideology which is making our streets more dangerous. This kind of lock them up and throw away the key brand of conservatism obviously isn't pure ideology in what passes for Neil's brain. But a journalist who I follow very closely, Ian Birrell, the foreign correspondent whose work appears everywhere, has picked up on this and pointed out that locking up offenders, many of whom have autism or learning disabilities or mental health concerns, in overcrowded, drug-filled hellholes with too few staff and minimal rehabilitation efforts, makes our streets more dangerous by fueling recidivism. Both the Prisons Minister and the Justice Secretary are right to say that we need less prison and more rehabilitation. I'd have thought that was a no-brainer. In many ways, what Neil O'Brien is doing, without realising it, is pointing out that his position is entirely ideological and unevidenced, whereas the position that if you want people to commit fewer crimes, make sure that something happens to them when they come to the attention of the authorities that makes them likely to commit fewer crimes. You'd have thought it was a no-brainer. But here's the bit I don't get yet. So, the Justice Secretary declared yesterday that prison isn't working for women. She's announced measures to reduce the number of female offenders in the prison estate. More women will be treated in the community. Cases involving women will be resolved before they get to court. The number of, efforts to drive down the number of young women self-harming would be drawn up by a new body of experts. There's a lot here that needs explaining. She said, for women, prison isn't working. Rather than encouraging rehabilitation, prison forces women into a life of crime. After leaving a short custodial sentence, a woman is significantly more likely to commit a further crime than one given a non-custodial sentence. Right, so there's point one. Why? Why would... and this is something you're going to have to tell me from experience, all right? This is, in fact, in tribute to Neil O'Brien, let's remove it entirely from the realms of ideology and root it firmly in the realms of experience. Not necessarily data, because the plural of anecdote is not data, but rooting it in experience, which will be more helpful to the rest of us. I'll give you some data. I'll give you a statistic. I'll give you some evidence. After a short custodial sentence, a woman is significantly more likely to commit a further crime than one given a non-custodial sentence. And again, giving us some genuine food for thought, she goes on to state, or she went on to state, the shameful fact is we have known this for 2 decades. In 2007, Baroness Jean Corsten, another pioneering Labour woman, undertook a landmark review. It was clear then, and it is clear now, that if we change how we treat women in prison, we cut crime, we keep families together, and we end the harm that passes from one generation to the next. And the numbers aren't huge, but I'm hoping, and this will sound a little bit odd, I'm hoping that they're big enough for there to be enough people listening to this programme with some personal experience of this to answer some of the questions that I have. So the first is obvious. Why does a custodial sentence, why does a short custodial sentence increase the likelihood of reoffending when compared with a non-custodial sentence? Got some answers to that on Monday, didn't we, when we talked about the 12-year-old getting a referral order having been caught in the riots, and the 14-year-old being essentially let off because his parents were so clearly outraged and disgusted by his involvement in the riots. The 12-year-old's mother was so unconcerned, she went on holiday to Ibiza. And we talked about the referral order as a punishment, but as the conversation went on, it changed shape. The word changed meaning as the conversation unfolded, and in fact it became clear that a referral order was more of a treatment than a punishment. It was more of a rehabilitative exercise than a punishment, than a penalty, a penalisation. So that will be part of the answer to the question regarding women in prison. But why would that be true? Why is it different? This is a much more nuanced question, and I don't know off the top of my head what the answers to this might be. Why is it different? Why does prison play a different role in the life of a female offender than it does in the life of a male? It might be that there are some obvious questions to that, but they currently elude me. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. So why would a short custodial sentence increase the likelihood of reoffending among women when compared with a... That will also be true of men, which is probably where we're going to lead to the third question. But why would reoffending be more likely after a prison sentence than after a non-custodial sentence? The question that interests me most, and this would be one you might want to answer if your mum went to jail, or your sister, or you. Why is a prison sentence why is it a kind of measurably different punishment for a woman compared to a man? Maybe you think it isn't, but I would suggest looking at the data that it is. And it feels different as well, doesn't it? Sending a mother to jail, for example, feels very different from sending a father. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, because the mother would ordinarily be more likely to taking up the bulk of the childcare. So, and Beatrice goes further. She says to me, there's a much lower threshold for sentencing women to prison than men. Men are not sent to prison for many of the crimes that women are jailed for. There's also little or no rehabilitation or probation for people sentenced for under it. Not little or no. She says there's no rehabilitation or probation for people sentenced for under a year. Women often have short sentences and come out to no home, no job, and family breakdown. It's obviously destructive. So why is prison different for women compared to men? 0345 6060 973. And the third question is the one that runs through this programme like Blackpool through a stick of rock. The third question is what was it like? What is it like? What is it like for a woman? And we're not talking about murderers. We're talking about short sentences for relatively, and please remember what the word relatively means, for relatively minor crimes. Why is the impact on a woman greater than the impact on a man? And why does it feel, to me at least, and maybe it doesn't to you, why does it feel more wrong to send a woman to jail than a man? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. So let's just clarify on that. The question number one, why does the custodial sentence make everything worse, not better? It increases the likelihood of reoffending. Question number two, why does it feel so different? Why does the notion of jailing women, and if Beatrice is right and we're sending women to jail for offences that men wouldn't be jailed for, this question becomes more pertinent. What is it here that makes us think that locking up women is worse, is a worse thing for a society to do than lock up men? 0345 6060 973. And what happened in your world? What happened in your world? The difference, God forbid that your mum and your dad were sent to jail at different times, but that would at least put you in a position to answer some of these questions from a unique and powerful perspective. My life was much more altered when mum got sent down than it was than when dad got sent down. But when the woman in your life, or when you as a woman were sent to jail, what can you tell me about why that experience would be different from a man's, or just simply about the impact that it had on your life? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Look, some of these questions will apply equally to men as to women. The reoffending thing will do as well. But we're talking about this today because this is what the Justice Secretary addressed yesterday. She declared that prison isn't working for women. And I think that certainly in the first instance, you don't go after you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If she wants to start with women and then apply similar measures to men later, that's absolutely fine. But that's why we're talking about this today, because this is what the Justice Secretary announced yesterday. And I want to look at that question I want to look at the different, why we should specifically talk about women prisoners and men prisoners, not just a homogenous blob of prisoners. All right? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Sarah's got some answers. Women commit hardly any sex crimes, very few violent crimes. It's the sexual and violent offenders that I want locked up. So there you go. We're just sort of nibbling at the edges of what some of the answers to these questions might be. But as ever, I want more. James Timpson, the prisons minister, also told a meeting in Liverpool this week that he saw lots of very ill women when he visited prisons, and he wanted to reduce the numbers incarcerated. We need to decide as a society what is the best way to help these women. I mean, when he talks about being ill, he's almost certainly referring to the women in custody. Young women in custody make up about 1/10 of the overall prison population, but account for more than 1/3 of all cases of self-harm. So it's a worse punishment for a woman, it would seem, or it affects women in ways that it does not affect men on the same scale. Why? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 11:15, and obviously, if you're a woman who's been to jail, or a woman in your life has been to jail, then you will have or you've worked in the system, you'll have a particular perspective on this. But everybody's welcome.
James O'Brien on LBC.
15 minutes after 11. How many grounds for dispatch to Idiot's Corner can you get into a single text? What is the most? So you've got a 5-line text. How many different grounds for dispatch to Idiot's Corner do you think you can get into a 5-line text? Because John's had a really good crack at it. Ready? Hi, James. Starmer has had no compunction in sending women to prison for social media posts. So, Idiot's Corner number 1, Starmer hasn't sent anybody to prison. It's judges that do that, champ. Even when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, he wouldn't have been able to decide upon the sentence for a given criminal. But let's pretend that he could do then. He can't do that now. So, that's Idiot's Corner number 1. Prison for social media posts criticising the government, though, has he? Right. He hasn't. I mean, even if he could send people to jail for social media posts criticising the government, he hasn't. Because the only people being sent to jail for social media posts are, well, let's work out what grounds 3 for Idiot's Corner is. Even when they were carers for their disabled husband. Writes John. So I think you're probably referring to the 53-year-old woman who lived a quiet, sheltered life and was jailed for 15 months for posting on Facebook. But she didn't post criticism of the government, champ. She posted, blow the mosque up with the adults in it. So she was inciting terrorism, effectively, and was probably lucky not to be charged with that offence. So there we go. That is a 5-line text which contains 3, possibly 4 stone-cold reasons for being sent straight to Idiot's Corner. Do you know what the real tragedy is? Is that you're listening to this now and you're still too stupid to realise how stupid you are. So let's run through it again. Starmer has had no compunction in sending women to prison for social media posts criticising the government, though, has he? Starmer hasn't sent anybody to prison. Nobody has been sent to prison by anybody for social media posts criticising the government, even when they were carers for their disabled parents, husband or children. But they don't exist. These people that you think were being sent to jail by somebody who can't send people to jail for doing things that nobody has been sent to jail for doing, it wouldn't matter whether they were carers for anybody, would it? Because none of them exist. The offence hasn't been committed, and you, sir, are an absolute balloon. But at least you've now got representatives in Parliament. 19 minutes after 11 is the time. Back to women in prison. Joe is in Chester. Joe, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello,
it's
Joe.
the first time I've ever called your programme.
You're
so
very
I'm really
welcome.
nervous.
It's only me. There's nothing to be nervous about.
You, and that's terrifying. So it's really difficult. I committed a credit card fraud for £200 on a company credit card way back in 2015. And went to the magistrate's court, and for whatever reason, I was sent to prison for 8 weeks.
Gosh. Were you expecting that? Were your lawyers expecting a custodial sentence?
No, goodness me, no. It was almost Friday afternoon, Friday the 13th of December. Last person on in the magistrates, 2 young children, husband, pretty nice life, and off I went, which was terrifying to end up in HMP style. But women's prisons are just so broken, they're heartbreaking. There are people that need to be there, yes there are, but it's full of people like me, we've all had good lives, made a mistake, done something wrong, and I came out of that 8 weeks. I actually came out after 4 weeks, but I came out utterly destroyed, completely mentally. very unsupportive relationship at the time.
I'm sorry.
Went on to commit a bigger crime because I'd spent 4 weeks with people who'd done much bigger things.
It was that, you see that in such simple terms. You were taught or encouraged or trained.
All you hear all day is you're sitting with people that I'd never been with in my life before.
Yes.
Pretty desperate situation when I came out, and I went on to commit a £30,000 fraud, which went to the Crown Court, and I was expecting a serious custodial sentence.
Yeah.
But I didn't get one because the judge said, you actually need help. You need psychiatric help. So I've done a 12-week mental health treatment plan, which is amazing, which is the Ministry of Justice have brought in. I've also had lots of rehab sessions. I've done lots of community hours. And you know something, that has changed my life in such a positive way.
Well, I never.
And I think women in particular, it isn't a punishment to send me into prison for 4 weeks. It just punished my children and my parents. I actually had 4 weeks break from an awful relationship at the time.
Right.
But what I needed was help, psychiatric help. And I've had that. And now I'm living with my kids. We live in a little house in Chester, and life is really positive. And I think we need to be less just putting people into a cell with serious criminals. We need to be treating people. We need to get to the root of this psychiatric issue as why we're doing this, and women in particular.
Why? And I'm asking this from a position of curiosity, not criticism. But why women in particular? Some people will be wondering.
Because I think a lot of women are being sent to prison, taken away from their children, which men are too, but historically and traditionally, women's prisons, all prisons are terrible places, but there's a lot of women in prison that do need mental health support. Yeah. There's a lot of men the same. I think it's the whole judicial system.
The problems might not be unique to women, but they're going to be more prevalent.
Yeah, it's
for example, self-harm being the most obvious example.
Oh, it's wicked. I mean, I was put in a cell, and within 2 hours of being there, I was trying to watch someone kill themselves. It's horrendous. We need to try and get to the root cause, and I know we're not going to address it for everyone, but we certainly can for a big proportion, particularly mums, and there's a lot of mums in there that have gone to prison for an economic crime. They shouldn't have done it. No one's condoning it. But the psychiatric treatment plan that I have had has literally changed my life. I think completely differently now about things.
And you are confident you won't reoffend?
Oh, no, never. Absolutely. My mind.
You got sent down for 200 quid and not sent down for 30,000?
Because it's the magistrates versus
the
judge.
Okay.
And I think a lot of magistrates are sending women to prison. There's some great magistrates out there, don't get me wrong.
But some people are perhaps drawn to it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Someone who would love to be a magistrate sending women to prison, he's called Ed, and he writes, O'Brien giving this woman the time of day sums up everything that is wrong with this country. So your feet wouldn't have touched the ground if he'd been
and you know, that's really bad, isn't it? You know, something. People do things wrong. We're human. Humans make mistakes. Some make massive mistakes. But there are some crimes that actually can be addressed with psychiatric help, and we need to be looking at that and the sentencing guidelines a little bit broader.
Yeah, and I think some of the answers to why, you've used the phrase better than me actually, why that phrase women in particular is pertinent and relevant here will be obvious, and some of them won't. And in particular is such a more helpful description, because it's not saying that this stuff doesn't also apply to men, but it applies in particular to women. I'll show you what I mean, actually. I don't know whether George deserves a ticket. He might do. He goes, we keep being told that females are as capable, tough, strong and able to do any job in any situation as any male. I don't know who keeps telling you that, George. Seriously, I mean, maybe you should change your social circle a bit. It sounds like a very weird topic of conversation. Every time George walks into the pub, everybody turns around to him and says, women should be able to do any job in any situation that men are allowed. Why don't you just talk about the darts? Or the football? Sorry, that's a bit sexist. Why don't you just talk about crochet or knitting? Sorry, that's a bit sexist. Why don't you just talk about the things that don't make you furious? Why on earth do people keep telling George that females are as capable, tough, strong and able to do any job in the way? The typical feminist approach is that females want all the rights but none of the responsibilities, says George. Linda, however, knows what she's talking about, and she writes, every single government-ordered report, consultation, research, etc. has said the same thing. The majority of women in prison have histories of victimisation, of sexual violence, very high incidence of self-harm and substance misuse. Prisons are completely ineffective at addressing the consequences of this life experience, and every recommendation from Colston in 2007 onwards has argued for community-based specialist intervention, particularly those interventions that can deal with the trauma that a lot of women in prisons are living with, if you can call it that. So there you go. Those are the two perspectives. One from a position of complete ignorance and one from a position of complete evidence. It's 11:26. Dawn's in Chiswick. Dawn, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Dawn.
I work in police custody. I'm a mental health professional working in the police custody, and I've worked in the criminal justice system for about 20 years. And this kind of subject is quite passionate with me.
Well, clearly.
The criminological argument, James, is for women is that they got a lot more to lose than men do. I'm not being sexist. That is a criminological.
Don't tell George that, will you? He'll have an embolism. Tell me more. What do you mean by that? Some of it's obvious. Some of it might not.
It's already been touched on already, I believe, by the previous callers. But the women have got a lot more to lose. Like with children, for an example, with children, them being a parent, especially a single parent, the consequences of them going to prison are longer lasting because women are more likely, 9 out of 10 are more likely to be the sole carers or to be the main carers of children
or parents
or a carer to a family member.
Yeah.
And it's the children, and that's already been touched on. The children suffer more and likely to go into care. Also, these women are also, a lot of these women have a lot of trauma behind them, and that's like domestic violence.
Yes.
And I've come across this. A lot of women, unfortunately, some women get involved who are they're not victims. They are survivors of domestic violence.
Yes.
But unfortunately,
so these are all things that are much more likely to apply to women than they are to men.
Absolutely.
I hope George is taking notes.
And women are, then when they go to court, James,
yes.
Women are, society sees women as the nurturers, the carers, yeah?
Yes.
And they get frowned upon. It's just like, why, society, would say, why are you doing this? You shouldn't be doing this as such. Women are likely to, and as I said, regarding them, I'm coming across women in my current job, and I've been doing this for 5 years in custody. Yeah. A lot of women who are survivors of the DV, especially. I'm just giving an example.
Yes.
Who have been victims over many, many years. And then when they fight back or have the power to fight back,
right.
They get involved, they get arrested,
yeah.
And then they become criminalised. Do you understand? One minute they were holding a job, they're trying to hold a family down, and next minute because they fought back, then they get involved in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
I'm not saying, listen, I've worked for a single parent. I'm a single parent myself. I'm not saying men are not the caregivers. I'm just saying the majority of the carers, like the parents, majority are the mothers. They are mothers.
Women in particular. It's Joe's phrase, isn't it? It's not. It's not excluding men or denying men. It's just women in particular. Women in particular.
Thank you, James. I just want to endorse that.
Yes, you put it brilliantly well. I think you'll quite like this phrase that Shabana Mahmood used yesterday at conference when she described women's jails as desperate places that were hurting mothers and breaking homes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's a powerful phrase, that, isn't it? And it brings home a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, answers a lot of the questions that we've been asking.
And prison, quickly, James, is a school. I don't think, especially for short sentences, do not do anything, okay?
Yeah.
And that they do not work. For these women, we need to go down the public health model for these women now.
And we literally just heard from someone who escalated from a relatively minor offence that you weren't expecting to get jailed for to a major offence that you were expecting to get jailed for as a consequence of incarceration, and who has responded to psychiatric help by describing her own life as being unrecognisable, as being completely transformed, and the likelihood of repeating the patterns of behaviour that led to criminality becomes minimised. It depends what you want. If you get a thrill out of sending people to jail, particularly women, if you're a misogynist, I suppose, like some of our correspondents this morning, then you'll hate all of this stuff. If you as a member of society want less offending and less trauma and less heartbreak and less broken families, then you'll be in favour of this proposal. That's not ideology, is it? That's just counting. Thank you, Dawn. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:32. Is that a bit of a glitch? Do not worry. That's when Keith goes into full emergency room mode and starts saying things like, I'm bringing us back, like he thinks he's George Clooney in ER or something like that. Apply what are they called? The defibrillator. We're back in the studio, we're back in the room. Keith saves the day. Once again, something went a little bit wrong with the adverts there. We need to get that sorted out, otherwise my mortgage won't get paid. We are discussing the imprisonment of women. Is Ed Conway joining us at 11:45, Joe? Is Ed Conway coming in today? I've got an amazing story for you in 10-15 minutes' time from Ed Conway, the Sky News journalist and best-selling author, about the dodging of sanctions. Like luxury cars are supposed to be sanctioned for Russians, and Ed has undertaken a frankly extraordinary investigation into whether or not, no spoilers, into whether or not serious high-end luxury cars are still making their way into Russia on an epic scale. In fact, on a scale almost undimmed, perhaps, or entirely undimmed by the so-called sanctions imposed upon Vladimir Putin's population. And that Ed will be with us shortly. 0345 6060 973 is the number if you want to talk about women in prison. I'll squeeze in one more Idiot's Corner, I think, today, because I have already dealt with this, but I'm always here for idiots. I'm always here to help. So this is from Dan. He writes, be careful which bits of this I can repeat, given that the case is live and ongoing. But the men that broke a police officer's nose and committed multiple assaults on armed officers at Manchester Airport still haven't been sentenced. This is why so-called idiots in your corner talk about two-tier policing. Well, here's what you do, Dan, if you're confused by something that's happening in a field that you have little experience or knowledge of, which is what I do every day. I am confused by things that are happening in fields that I have little or no experience of or knowledge. So I ask people who do. So I end up speaking to Dawn about the criminal justice system, particularly for women. I end up speaking to Joe about what it's like as a woman to be sent to jail. I end up speaking in a moment to Heather, who was a probation officer and worked with female prisoners. And when I see confusion about the case that you're referring to, I speak to lawyers. I speak to, in this case, a barrister who told me this. There is nothing unusual about a serious incident involving a police officer taking a long time for charging decisions to be made. These cases have fewer resources devoted to them and present fewer complexities than, for example, some racist fool filming himself throwing bricks at riot officers, which is why it has been possible to charge many, although by no means most, of the Farage rioters swiftly. Quite simply, it's under investigation. That's as much as anybody knows. It's clear from the CCTV that this incident has been selectively presented on social media, including by the family concerned, and there will be other evidence and lines of inquiry which we are not aware of. The officer in question is also apparently under internal investigation by the IOPC, so there are lots of moving parts. I imagine before the CPS is able to decide A, who is to be charged, and B, with what offences. So I'm not going to put you in Idiot's Corner unless you still think that this is somehow evidence of what racists and liars call two-tier policing. Because now you know it isn't, because you've asked a lawyer, or at least you've asked me and I've asked a lawyer on your behalf. But if you still think it is, then it's Idiot's Corner for you, Dan. Amazing public service broadcasting today. Heather is in Hazelmere. Heather, what would you like to say?
I'm a retired probation officer, and I worked with a lot of women, both with community sentences, but a lot with prison. I also wrote reports for the court, and I worked with the domestic violence team. Women go to prison for very different reasons to men. The reason a short sentence won't work is because it will break the family. As your previous callers have said, the majority of women are often the sole carers for families. If they go to prison, they will lose their children. Their children will go into care. They will often, if they're in social housing, lose their tenancy.
Yes.
They'll come out of prison, no tenancy, so they can't get their children back. And that will drive most women to reoffending because they'll feel, what have I got to lose? There's mental health issues. The reasons behind women offending are massive. And sort of referring to what the magistrates do, I once wrote a paper entitled Mad, Bad or Dotty, because that is what a magistrate referred to women in court as, mad, bad or dotty.
Wow.
There are some fabulous magistrates, as someone has already said. There are some very misogynistic magistrates.
Well, the person who said there are some fabulous magistrates was the one who was sent to jail for a £200 credit card fraud. So
there are some good magistrates. Yes. There are some understanding and compassionate. There's also a problem often of what we call up-tariffing. So a man will often get a lower sentence than a woman, and that can sometimes be because it's a misguided attempt to help the woman.
Okay.
If we give her this, and I can think of a case, and I obviously won't mention any details, there was early childhood sexual abuse, which resulted in heroin addiction, a disabled child, a dysfunctional relationship, already involved in social services, had a great social worker, but then the court threw so many requirements at this woman, it wasn't possible for her to manage them. They thought they were helping. They weren't. They were hindering.
Right.
Instead of looking at her overall life and saying, how is she, this disordered person, going to cope with this? If she failed that, then there's a very good chance she would be sent to prison. And how would that help anybody? Because women will come out to exactly the same circumstances that caused them to offend in the first place.
Or worse.
Or worse.
But never better.
Yes. Homeless.
Yeah.
Often homeless. So never better, no. But whatever drove them in the first place. I mean, I was a women's champion for 2 years, and I've seen this. It's heartbreaking. It's totally heartbreaking. I've been in women's prisons and seen what's going on. I've watched the youngsters. I've heard about the self-harm. I've seen the results of the self-harm. It's an internal cry of pain. And one of your callers said, often involved with domestic abuse. Yeah, often. Rooted in domestic abuse.
And so to you, I mean, you would be very much in agreement with my texter who referenced Causton. Every bit of research since 2007 when Baroness Causton looked into this has found it to be self-evident. that
absolutely. I mean, there are some women, don't get me wrong, there are some women, and I've certainly had one who'd committed a series of increasingly serious offences and saying, thank God I was sent to prison, Heather. I would have killed somebody in the end. And yes, she would have done. And she did. She was fortunate. The system worked for her. And we were able to engage her in therapeutic programs in prison. And then once she came in the community. But that's not common. I've been out of the service for a while. I don't know what they do now. But there was nothing for women because all the interventions anyway were premised on white males.
So the entire system is designed for that constituency of the population, and yet anyone who's not a white male is a sort of one-size-fits-all justice system, which is going to be I mean, obviously people of colour will be discriminated against, but women, and then women of colour more than anybody else.
Yeah. And of course, when mum goes to prison, children go into care. With the best will in the world, they're often split up because of circumstances. You've got a recipe for those children ending up in the criminal justice system ultimately. I'm not saying they will.
No, but the chances much increase.
Yeah, they're sensitised towards it. It's heartbreaking to watch, and it ties in with a lot of... I wouldn't say literacy, yes, but certainly literacy issues because of the family backgrounds. I'm generalising. I'm generalising.
Sure. Well, we have to.
Yeah. I mean, there's exceptions, and I can pick them out all the time. But if you've got literacy issues, if you've come from a dysfunctional family, if you've grown up with drugs and alcohol around you, you haven't got much in the way of life chances anyway, and you're going to be sensitised towards dysfunctional relationships yourself. It's a tragic circle.
55%, Heather. 55% of women prisoners were victims of domestic abuse. I mean, that's almost the beginning and the end of the conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say that's probably on the low side.
Yeah,
I had a case in the probation service when I was working, and we're not talking about 100 years ago, but I'm out of it now, thank God. You didn't have a lot of women on your caseload because often women weren't given the community sentences that would have actually helped them or could have helped them. But at one point, I had a group of women. I called them bleach ladies because they all had issues with self-harm. All of them differently rooted in domestic abuse. Some of them took a long time to get them to talk about it, and you realised actually, all the way through a whole stratus of society.
So, I mean, the more we talk about it, the more of a no-brainer this whole proposal
absolutely.
becomes. I suppose, as with everything that gives us hope about the new government, it is, however, going to involve more investment and more money than is currently available, although they save money by not sending people to prison. So it's more about a redistribution of funds, a reallocation, than it is about a need for more.
But it's not sexy, is it? I mean, the people you've sent to Idiot's Corner are saying, it's disgusting, it's disgraceful spending money on these people.
Yeah.
If you look at something like a Norwegian model, where they treat it, it's very, very different.
Keith's always looking at Norwegian models, Heather.
I'm sure he is, but if you look at the way they deal with criminal justice, and some of the Scandinavian countries, I mean, simply, we used to meet up with sometimes Norwegian probation officers used to come across, but they have a much more therapeutic approach. And I'm not condoning crime. Don't get me wrong.
No one thinks you are. You don't have to second guess yourself. I mean, that's part that actually highlights the problem that you're alluding to when you talk about the stories being sexy. I feel it sometimes. I have to second. Nobody is saying that murderers should walk free, but literally nobody is saying that murderers should walk free. So why do people like Heather and me feel that we have to clarify that nobody is saying that murderers should walk free? It's just because of the bonkers. It's the same mode of journalism that spent all day yesterday telling you that the government wanted to shut pubs early. It's just not true. So why do those of us on the right side of a story feel the need to sort of address the manufactured concerns of people on the wrong side of stories? I don't know, but what a great call. Thank you so much. In fact, every call this hour, as is often but not always the case on this programme, has been extraordinary. I'll read you, because we talked about there being some good magistrates. Here's one, Liz. As an ex-magistrate, most women I came across broke the law for, quotes, valid, end quotes, reasons to feed their children because of mental health or an abusive partner. The list would be varied. And yes, there are some, quotes, evil women. But we can treat that category separately. We shouldn't break families up with punishment. We should build families with rehabilitation and guidance. Community service should be the future, not just for women. If you send a woman to prison, the social services have to be involved if there are children. Housing can be cancelled. Benefits can be stopped. The resources involved in any woman going to prison are horrendous. So obviously and surely there is another way. And this from a probation officer, from Claire. For high-risk females in the community, I can tell you that women are managed in a system created by men for men. Limited services for women, fewer female prisons result in women being sent out of area, that reduced visits from supporting family or friends. I have yet to work with a female that had not had a chaotic life of domestic abuse, mental health issues, substance misuse or sexual abuse. We need to break the cycle rather than breaking up the family and sending these females to establishments that normalise crime and institutionalise them. And just for balance on this subject, because absolutely everybody who knows what they are talking about has ended up in making a very similar point, making very, I would argue, obvious points about the wisdom of addressing these problems, that it is Caroline Criado Perez territory. Whoever sent that text, you're absolutely right. A system created by men for men. But just for balance, here is the Conservative MP Neil O'Brien on the subject. First, the Prisons Minister said that only a third of prisoners should be in jail. Now the Justice Secretary says she will cut the numbers in women's prisons by 2/3 and ultimately shut them. Pure ideology, which is making our streets more dangerous. So you can get elected to Parliament if you know nothing, and yet you end up banging your head against a brick wall if you've spent your entire career working in a system, and what the Justice Secretary said yesterday has been obvious to you since at least 2007, along, incidentally, with all the research that politicians like Neil O'Brien have to willfully ignore, I presume, in the event that they are actually aware that it even exists.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:49 is the time. I don't know what the rules are. I really don't. And I think, as Nick may have been discussing this morning, there's always a slight danger with attritional situations of fatigue. I'm thinking about Ukraine and Russia. But Ed Conway, the economics and data editor at Sky News, has undertaken an investigation which he sort of tweeted a thread about that absolutely hypnotised me last night, that just set all my cogs whirring. It set all my antennae twitching, because it's both an extraordinary story and a brilliant piece of journalism, but it's also a uniquely depressing glimpse of the reality of sanctions. And I thought it was such a great piece that it was worth inviting Ed into the studio today, and I'm delighted to tell you he managed to find the time to do so. Should we mention the book first, Ed? Because the book's doing really well.
I wasn't even expecting that, to be honest with you.
I can't plug my book several times an hour on the programme without occasionally...
Shall I plug yours and then
without occasionally giving a shout to Material World, which is an absolutely superb book, a substantial story of our past and future. But it's
less depressing than this.
Yes, it is. Yes, well, that wouldn't be hard, because this is... Well, I mean, you just tell the tale from the top. Why did you start looking into the possibility that luxury cars, despite being banned from entering Russia, were, spoiler alert, entering Russia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been trying to look at what's actually going on with sanctions for quite a while, because if I'm not, then who is? And the slightly depressing thing is actually very few people are looking into this. And the issue with looking at the data, so we have various sanctions on Russia. There's sanctions that are supposed to be preventing the oil from coming out at a certain price. There's sanctions on certain individuals in Russia, in the regime. There's sanctions on us sending stuff into Russia, and that includes, obviously, most importantly, dual-use goods, stuff that can be used as weapons. And it also includes luxuries, so that if you're in the regime, if you're supporting the regime, then you're not able to enjoy those Western luxury cars. But the reality is, when you look at the data, and this is the kind of curious thing, I'm into data, I'm into charts. And
don't say it like it's something to be ashamed of.
No apologies. I do not apologise for that.
I'm Ed and I love data.
Yes, exactly. Support me. But one of the charts that was really striking about this is basically it shows that the exports to Russia, whether it's luxury cars or whether it's these dodgy sanctioned items that can be turned into weapons, they do stop when it comes to when those sanctions are imposed, when the Ukraine invasion happens. But lo and behold, at the same point, they rise enormously to Caucasus states, places like Azerbaijan, places like Georgia, places like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. And the problem with this, is because the data's saying that, you and I can look at it, and most human beings would look at that and say, well, it's kind of obvious what's happening there. It's going in via the back door because all these countries border on Russia. But a lot of people, including, for instance, the car lobby group, can look at that chart and say, oh, well, there's no data trail. There's no paper trail, so our cars are not going to Russia. So that's kind of...
It's all a massive coincidence.
It's a massive coincidence. Well, Azerbaijan is doing brilliantly.
Right.
Their appetite for luxury cars, which, by the way, is greater now than for Switzerland, is entirely plausible. And so I thought that was a little implausible, but until you kind of go out there and see what's going on, you don't really know. So I went out to the Russian border. Actually, it's more, we had a tip-off, basically. Someone sent us a picture of a Range Rover on the border, and I thought, well, we need to go out and see that. So we went out and tried to find it. We didn't see the Range Rover, but we did see an incredible concentration of luxury cars, more than I'd ever seen before, outside of kind of Mayfair or Dubai. They're waiting at the border to go over, and we talked to people about the process of how this happens. They explained there's one person who brings the cars up to the border. Maybe they come from Azerbaijan, maybe they come from the port here. There's another person who takes them over the border. They say to the person at the border, but the border guard, listen, they're going to Kyrgyzstan, and it's my car. Neither of which are true. Everyone knows the score. They know they're going into Russia. Then they leave the car on the other side of the border in Russia, and now they're in Russia, and someone else comes with a carrier and takes it up to Moscow or wherever it is. And we saw that. We didn't see it for Range Rovers, and we thought, oh gosh, okay, well, there's lots of German cars here. We kind of know the principle. That's enough. And so we headed down towards Tbilisi.
This is the mad bit, isn't it?
It's crazy. We headed down,
literally tootling along the road
towards the airport, really. And then suddenly, coming the other direction on this one road that goes up towards Russia, was a convoy of carriers, including two what looked like brand new Range Rovers.
I should explain, you're particularly interested in Range Rovers, A, because that was your tip-off, but B, because they're British manufactured.
Because they're British made. because they're made in Britain. I mean, it's not. Yeah, we're not trying to pick on a particular. If it had been a Bentley as well, for that matter, then it would have been the same thing. But we turned around and gave chase up the hill for 2 hours, and lo and behold, they ended up at the border at the exact same car park where all of these luxury cars are, and we know what happens next. And I mean, the reason we're focusing on luxury cars, though, it's not because we're prurient or we think that this stuff shouldn't be going across. Although there are sanctions on this, it's explicit. But it's mostly because you can see them going across. It's there in the light of day. And like I say, no one is trying to hide it.
No.
They're pretty unapologetic about it. We talk to lots of people and they just joke about it. We say, where are the cars going? And they're like, where do you think they're going? We're like, come on, where are they going?
But these are people involved in the illegal transit of it.
But because it's kind of split up in this clever way, each person has a plausible deniability. Oh, I was only taking the cars up to the border.
Who would pursue them anyway, Ed? Whose remit would this fall under?
I mean, that's where it gets tricky because you're not supposed, if you're JLR or any car group, or for that matter Mercedes, you're not supposed to be sending these cars to somewhere if you know that they are going via there to Russia. But because this is now a well-oiled machine and you have lots of brokers working and they buy the cars who knows where, maybe they buy them in Germany and take them across. It is not. It's so difficult to police, and so I've got some time for those explanations from JLR, and they are doing everything they can on this. But by the same token, it's happening, and it's weird to go there and to see it brazenly in front of you. Sanctions are being broken, and it's very leaky.
I mean, not to make light of it, but it is a little bit like a scene from the Fast and Furious franchise of movies. The collection of supercars, and I don't really have the petrol head gene, but even my eyebrows rose at the sheer number of some of the most expensive or prestigious cars on the planet.
In quite a woebegone place.
Yes, looking as if there's a sort of jamboree being the kind of thing my father-in-law goes to with his vintage car back. All of these, the brand new and absolutely top of the range.
It is surreal and almost quite farcical. But it is depressing because you know the same thing is happening with drone parts.
Because the sanctions are designed to hurt Vladimir Putin by hurting the very wealthy people in Russia, whose patience would then diminish with his regime, and their patience is not going to be diminished if they're still getting their mitts on this gear.
And if that were only one dimension of it, that might be just about, you could put up with that. But we are importing liquefied natural gas from Siberia to Europe on British operated ships. That's another story we did a few months ago. We are taking the oil from Russia, except we're not taking it directly. We're sending it to India, where it goes into a refinery and turned into diesel, and kerosene, which comes to the UK and then goes in our planes and our cars. So we are a part of this. And I think the deeper and more awkward question about this is this failing because ultimately we're not ready, and I say we, Europe as a whole, are not ready to make the economic sacrifices necessary to do this seriously, because we're not waging economic war right now in practice. We've got sanctions, but they are leaky, and it's not having the effect that it's desired. Because look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. Russia is able to get 4 missiles for every one that the Ukrainians can. They have lots of money coming in from us in part, down to those oil and gas revenues. And as a result, they're doing okay.
It's a £20 billion trade overall that is supposed to have been sanctioned. We've got no real way of knowing how much of that is just flim-flam, have we?
No, and like I say, the data... I love data, but the data only kind of tells you part of this story. The reality is there on the ground, and it's being flouted in an industrial scale.
I mean, just to sort of add another dimension, the technology on board these vehicles these days means that the manufacturers would know exactly where they are. There's usually a SIM card built into the or a GPS type.
You'd have thought, and I've had those conversations with car makers, and they get quite awkward about those conversations. Partly because they say, "Well, listen, that compromises our ability to do something about it."
Right.
But then you kind of think, "Well, what are you doing about it? Are you able to remotely disconnect these cars or to disable them?" That's certainly not happening. And right now, you can see it on Instagram and elsewhere. There are lots of Range Rovers available in the showrooms in Moscow. There's lots of Bentleys as well, Rolls Royces, the whole thing. They're coming in through various different routes. I was only looking at one particular route. But I do find it a bit shocking that, I was the first journalist to do this 2.5 years on.
Yeah.
And as far as we know, the authorities are not clamping down on this.
And that was my final area of curiosity, actually, which I think you've just answered. The reason why they're using carriers as opposed to driving the vehicles all the way to Moscow is because they're going into showrooms to be sold as brand spanking new.
Yeah, these are new cars. The only mileage they do is that bit over the border.
Right.
That it's like a few hundred yards they go over the border.
Drive, is it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit disappointing, but it is. Yeah, it's one of the most striking stories that I've been involved in.
Well, and I urge you to have a look at the Sky News report, because it is, again, not wanting to sensationalise or trivialise, it is an extraordinary investigation. But how often does an investigative journalist end up smack in the middle of the evidence? I can't think of a precedent for it. Because normally you'd have to have your ear to a keyhole or a secret camera, or you'd have to be undercover with a lens in your lapel, but you literally walk into a like a jumble sale.
It was very surreal.
Yes.
But the funny thing is, it didn't feel dangerous at all. And that's partly, I think, because these people are not trying to hide it. They're not trying to have security around them, because on these vehicles, this industrial process just carries all the time.
Ed Conway, economics and data editor at Sky News. What are you working on next? Do you know? Can you tell us?
I cannot possibly divulge.
You could tell me, but then you'd have to kill me. Always a pleasure, Ed. Thank you very much indeed. It's 12 noon.
James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 12 is the time. Do you want to play a missing word round? Should we do a missing word round? I like this headline a lot. It tallies, well, I don't want to give it away, but it tallies with some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. That tweet, that message about some people would rather 10 people who need help go without in order to stop one person who doesn't need it getting it, i.e., you get rid of the safety net because one person's using it as a trampoline. And some of us would accept 10 undeserving recipients of needed help if it meant that one deserving one got it. So, excuse me, more. What is the missing word in this headline? Don't let me go home without revealing the answer to this one, all right? Blank people are seen as more physically attractive. Don't cheat, but I will accept your answers via all the usual means of communication. You can text me on 84850. You can WhatsApp. You can send a WhatsApp, 03456, a WhatsApp message on 0345 6060 973, or you can use social media. Blank people are seen as more physically attractive. They scored about 10% higher in terms of attractiveness than, I don't want to give you a spoiler alert, are 7% higher than clever candidates. So blank people are seen as more physically attractive. So it's about a non-physical attribute somehow enhancing your physical attractiveness to other people. I'll give you a clue. I'd be like George Clooney if this was true. I mean, this is just... No, I'm joking. So blank people are seen as more physically attractive. Well, it's not rich. No, stop. Behave yourself, Peter. And it's not bald, sadly, but you never know. So I said, God, Lord, there's a lot of answers coming in, and so far, absolutely none of them correct. So no, I'm very sorry, James. It's not hairy, fat people, unfortunately, and neither is it actually blank people, Marcus. It's not Irish people, Johnny. This is all wishful thinking. Every single one here is wishful thinking. You're just describing yourself. It's not radio hosting people either, Callum, but thank you. So what is it? Blank people are seen as more physically attractive. I got a little folder of stories that we haven't got around to doing yet, and there's one that we're not going to do now, and I don't know that we're ever going to do it, because I think it's just the same phone-in. I think if we did it as a topic, I'd just get the same phone call off 10 different people. I know what you're thinking. You've heard loads of phone-ins like that, but that's not what we try not to do it here. But an airline has banned a couple who started rowing over a reclining seat. And I don't know why that speaks to me so loudly, and it doesn't speak to other people at all. I mentioned it to a couple of colleagues, and they both said, well, if the person in front puts the seat down, you just put your seat down. And it sort of goes like dominoes, or sort of rubbish, half-fallen domino. And I don't know that you know what it's like. The person in front puts their seat down, you're automatically enraged. Especially on a short flight. Why have you done this? Why have you put your seat down? Well, I mean, it makes very little difference. You can go to sleep anyway. You've put your seat down. You've used up my space. My dinner is practically on my chin now. But as I say, I don't think it is necessarily a topic. But I wanted to tell you about it. Cathay Pacific has banned a Hong Kong couple from its flights completely after their row with a mainland Chinese traveller over her reclining seat. That's how the BBC chose to report it. She complained on social media that she was being harassed by the couple seated behind her on a Cathay flight after reclining her seat. Extraordinary social media explosion, 194,000 likes by the time the airline got involved, and she described how a middle-aged couple has accused her of obstructing their view of the television. So they asked her to put her seat back up. She refused. I mean, this would be the topic, but I don't know that people want to ring me up and tell me about the obnoxious things they've done in response to somebody else's obnoxious behaviour. When she refused to put her seat back up, the woman in the couple behind stretched her legs out and put them on the armrests of her seat. So she put her legs through the gaps in the chair. So you've got her feet, I'm not going to say cheesy feet, because they don't eat dairy much in that part of the world. So she put her feet in the right next to her. I mean, that's pretty grim. Whose side would you be on? I don't know. Sought help from a flight attendant who told her that she might want to straighten her seat, and she said, no, I don't want to. It's not meal time. So she was quite tough. And yet the other couple are the ones that have been banned. They also then went in for a bit of quasi-racism abuse, using language she didn't understand but did know contained the insult mainland girl in a derogatory tone. And then the husband started frantically pushing the back of her seat, and she filmed herself with the seat actually vibrating. This, to me, is a perfectly understandable situation. But anyway, I didn't think we'd get an hour out of it. I just wanted to share with you the news from the world of what do you call them? I don't know, seat fascists on aeroplanes. Here's the thing I want to talk about. I can't get it. This must be the third or fourth time in the last few months that we've tried to nail this down. And it doesn't matter who's in charge politically, really. They both seem to subscribe, both major parties seem to subscribe to the existence of a significant slice of population that we can never find. And that means either they don't exist or we're looking in the wrong places. And I'm still leaning towards, by dint of doing it again on the radio, we must be looking in the wrong places, mustn't we? You keep reading about people who aren't working. We looked up the numbers earlier this week for people who are not in education, young people aged between 16 and 25 who are not in education, employment or training. Keir Starmer is the latest politician to tie it to immigration, although he doesn't do it in as obnoxious a way as some of his Conservative colleagues have done over the years, both in politics and in the media. But he still subscribes to the idea that you can somehow reduce the number of people coming here by ensuring that people who are already here do jobs that they are not currently doing and that we might otherwise need to be done by people who have to come here to do them. So Starmer has addressed this in his speech yesterday, and I still don't get it. Here he is. He says, I have never thought we should be relaxed about some sectors importing labour when there are millions of young people, ambitious and talented, highly talented, who are desperate to work and contribute to their community. So I don't really like the knitting of this story to immigration, because it always worries me that the people that who have come here to do jobs are essentially hearing a message that we didn't really want you after all, and you're only here under sufferance. That phrase of training our own, particularly in the context of the NHS, always struck me as a very cold and callous contribution to public discourse. But how often do we feel on this programme that we're rather swimming against the tide of much of the rest of the media that's allowed to express opinions? So he was strong on the Farage riots, describing how he would never let a minority of violent racist thugs terrorise our communities. But he did promise to get tough on the use of migrant labour to prop up the economy. All of which, rhetorically, absolutely depends on the existence of what he describes as millions of young people, ambitious and highly talented, who are desperate to work and contribute to their community. Which leads us back to the question of why aren't they doing it now? There are two questions here. Do these people exist? I'm increasingly persuaded that they just don't. And that puts Starmer in the same sort of rhetorical vacuum that Tory Home Secretaries and Prime Ministers have been in for the last decade. Can you tell me about... I know you won't be able to find millions. Nobody's sofa's that big. But if you have a look down the back of your sofa, can you find a young person who is ambitious and highly talented and desperate to work and currently unable to do so? It's the strangest story of our time, this. It's why we keep circling back to it from various different angles. Where are these young people? And I'm not maligning the younger generation. It's full of ambitious and highly talented people, but the ones who are desperate to work will be working. Won't they? Is there something huge here that I'm missing? 0345 6060 973. I have never thought we should be relaxed about some sectors importing labour. Well, I'm relaxed about it until you add when there are millions of young people, ambitious and highly talented, who are desperate to work and contribute to their community. Because if that's true, then I don't think it would be particularly xenophobic or bigoted to say, well, why are we bringing in people to do things when there's millions of talented, ambitious people here who want to do those things? I just don't think it's true. You know what this is, don't you? This is one of those introductions where the longer it goes on, the more convinced I am of a point that I wasn't even sure about when I started talking. Show me, where are they? Ring me now. Right, seriously. I'll wait. Oh, I can't wait. Obviously, the emergency tape will kick in and Keith will have an embolism. But the question, that's it. So you start off with, are there really millions, and let's say thousands even, because they can't be millions, but millions. I think immigration this year is probably going to roughly halve compared to last year. So it's going to be down to, I would estimate, around the 300,000, 350,000 mark. Not because of anything the government have done in particular, but I'd do a lap of honour among the people who are obsessed with racism. I beg your pardon, obsessed with immigration. I'd do a lap of honour if I was Prime Minister or Home Secretary, just to sort of prove that it doesn't matter how low it comes. These people are still going to be shouting about it from the rooftops until kingdom come. But I think it's going to come down a lot, and probably again the year after. So there aren't millions of jobs being filled by foreign workers. And yet Keir Starmer says there are millions. I think this might be, unless you can prove me wrong, I think this might be among the stupidest things I've heard him say. Apart from the accidental moments of stupidity, like saying sausages instead of hostages. But there are millions of young people, millions of ambitious and highly talented young people who are desperate to work and contribute to their community, but who, I think, we must conclude, in his eyes, are not currently doing so. So we're talking about, and this isn't supported by any statistics, but Keir Starmer is persuaded that there are millions of young people, ambitious and highly talented, who are desperate to work and contribute to their community. Are there really? 03456. And no, that's not fair. What's holding them back? If we work on the presumption that they exist, what is holding them back exactly? 03456060973. And are these people really suffering from companies preferring to bring in people from overseas? Because that doesn't really make sense. It would be much easier to hire at home. Emma writes, my niece came out of university last year with a first and spent 3 months applying for a job in her specialist area, then 9 months applying for every job she could. She got about 5 interviews and it took her just over 14 months to get a job in that field. I suspect most young people who aren't working are in a similar situation. And yet, if they are not in education, employment or training, then the total number is 300,000. And that wouldn't be her, because she'd been in education for most of the last 5 years, up until the point where she got her degree. And without telling me what the field is, I've got no way of knowing whether these jobs, if they exist, are actually being filled by people who now need a special visa in order to come to this country, wherever they are in the world. I just don't get it, okay? And then we come to the story that is a little bit harder to be sceptical about. This is a quarter of UK employers report that new starters don't even turn up on their first day. So we apparently live in a country where there are millions of highly talented and ambitious young people desperate to work and contribute to their economy. But in the same country, 27% of businesses have made new hires, presumably largely of these hugely ambitious and highly talented young people who are desperate to work and contribute to their economy, their community, and they didn't turn up on their first day. It gets even worse when you look at people who've jacked it in after 12 weeks or within the first 12 weeks. So 27% of businesses had experienced no shows on day one. 41% of businesses have had newly signed up recruits, and this is from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development and Omni RMS, an outsourcing site. 41% have had people disappear or resign within the first 12 weeks. 56% of employers say that they are having difficulty retaining staff, and 69% note growing competition for skilled workers over the past 12 months. So part of it will be the very best candidates stockpiling offers. So let's imagine that Emma's niece got offered 5 jobs and she actually accepted all of them. She then didn't turn up for a couple and didn't bother telling them that she wasn't going to turn up because she was already planning to go and work somewhere else. But what is going on here? I want you to tell me about hiring young people. As an employer, I don't like the idea that they're all kind of work shy or lazy, but I also don't like the suggestion that they're all highly ambitious and talented, but somehow being prevented from doing jobs by immigration. So where are they? Where are these millions of young people that Keir Starmer is talking about? 0345 6060 973. What is stopping them? These highly ambitious, very talented people. What's stopping them from doing jobs? 0345 6060 973. And what's it like when you're trying to hire? What's it like when you're trying to hire a young person? Talk to me about people not turning up. Talk to me about people jacking it in. I told you about my hairdresser friend. I know what you're thinking. I've seen your hair. There's no way you've got a hairdresser friend. But when I come out of the salon, I look fantastic. It's only when I take responsibility for my own appearance that things start going a bit haywire. Literally. He has a terrible time of it. He's got people, and it's so hard to hire as well since Brexit because of the freedom of movement being abolished. A lot of Greek hairdressers, did you know that? It's quite a big industry in Greece. But he'll take someone on, and by lunchtime on the second day, they're complaining about being on their feet all day. And have you been in a hairdresser's before? Have you seen how? I know sometimes a stylist can sit down while they're doing some of the work, but I mean, who could possibly conceive an ambition to become a hairdresser without realising that it involves a lot of standing up? They'll be complaining about having to use scissors next. Oh, I really wanted to be a hairdresser. I didn't realise you had to use scissors all the time. They really hurt my knuckles. How has this taken 20 minutes, Keith? Did I start off doing something completely different? Oh, that'll be why. Well, I better stop now.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 23 minutes after 12. I will give you that missing word from the headline. What, or rather blank people, are seen as more physically attractive. So it's a non-physical attribute that somehow translates into physical attraction in the eye of the beholder. We should get stuck straight into the young people questions, plural, but I'm going to read this from Heather, and I'm not putting you in idiot's corner, Heather, because your last line, you may wish to research this point. Thank you, you add, politely. Just makes you sound a little bit too nice for Idiot's Corner, but here we go. Migrants are paid less than UK residents. My granddaughter applied for over 209 jobs. That's 210, isn't it? My granddaughter applied for over 209 jobs since graduating in May. So you're saying that foreign graduates are paid less than UK graduates. She now has a job in Canada and is leaving in November. It's the wage gap causing the problem. Apparently, you do not have to pay the minimum wage to migrants. You may wish to research this point. Thank you. It just sounds a bit of a mess, that thinking there, Heather. So, I mean, most obviously, your daughter is now a migrant. Your granddaughter is now a migrant, heading to a country where the ratio of refused visitor visas to approved ones is now higher than at any point since the height of the pandemic because of a growing anti-immigration sentiment in Canada, just as we have in all Western countries at the moment. But also, it's simply not true that you don't have to pay the minimum wage to migrants, and it's simply not true that most graduates would be expecting to be paid the minimum wage. So apart from that, great message. Xavier is in Deptford. Xavier, what would you like to say? What can you tell me?
Hi. Well, I'm 23. I'm going to be 24 in November. I graduated uni in July myself. I have a job. I'm a games developer. I've been working for a while. I did a placement, so I'm quite fortunate in that way that I had a job immediately out of uni, graduating. But I've had friends that have struggled a lot. One of my friends decided to go back to university and get his master's degree because he couldn't find a job. He had a degree in economics. Couldn't find a job to save his life.
But so either the job doesn't exist or it's currently being done by someone who wasn't born in Britain, which seems highly unlikely to me.
Yeah, I mean, where I work, we've been getting a few employees from India and from Pakistan.
Yes,
because they'll come over here. They'll do maybe a diploma, and then they'll be a placement student, or they'll come and work here full time as a part of that job, and they do get paid considerably less. For my offices are in Wandsworth, and that's one of the most expensive boroughs to live in. So it is actually a bit of an issue for even them to come here and work for less money than they would get.
But they will only be given visas in the event of your employer proving that it can't hire domestically. That's one of the so-called benefits of Brexit. So they're doing jobs that couldn't be done by somebody British, because if they could be done by somebody British, they wouldn't be able to get the visa. And then the employer is taking advantage of them by paying them less than they would have paid to somebody British.
Yes.
So it's the worst of all imaginable worlds. The employee is being exploited a bit. The myth that the job is somehow being taken off a British person can be inflated a bit as well. And the only winner is the employer.
Yeah, and this is what Brexit was for, really, isn't it? Well, we were fighting so that more British people could get more of the jobs here, and it almost feels like
why aren't British
less.
people applying for the jobs that these lads are doing?
Well, okay, a games developer job for
I don't know. I know as a figure of speech, but I really don't know. Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm a graduate. Look, I'll tell you, I'm on 30k. Okay, yeah. That's my annual salary. It would be reasonable to say I don't know, but it'd be reasonable to say that my colleagues who are on visas are earning anywhere between 10 to 15% less.
Okay,
so,
well, I thought it was going to be more than that.
Well, from my
so around say 25,
so
somewhere around the national average. But why?
Yeah.
So having established that they cannot come here without a special visa, without a protected sector visa, as in the employer can prove that they need to cast their net further afield, why aren't your people who were on your course applying for the jobs that the people we're talking about are doing?
My opinion on that is sort of to blame social media, really, is to blame the individualism, the sensationalism that seems to be so much bigger here than it is in other countries.
So they don't want this job?
Western countries. Exactly, yes. They don't want the lower paying job. They don't want
But what are they doing in the meantime?
Entry. Well, to give you...
This is turning into the Groundhog Day of phone-ins, not you.
Yeah.
But every single time I try and address this, and Keir Starmer used the word millions. Xavier. Is it Xavier or Xavier? What do you Xavier. Forgive me. Keir Starmer used the word millions. There's millions of young people who want to work, and yet every time we talk about it, we end up knocking at this door here, which is they don't want to take that kind of job, and I don't know what they do in the meantime, anecdotally or otherwise.
My partner has taken a job that many other people don't want. She's taken a very low paying teaching assistant job, having just graduated, with very good grades. She got a first class degree in psychology, is getting paid pennies to handle misbehaving and kids that really need to be in specialized schools, but can't afford to be. So she's getting underpaid to do a job that requires a lot of her.
And what would be her dream job?
Well, it would be with children. It would be child development. It would be doing something perhaps with in the civil service. making.
But that door is not closed
better.
to her because of migration, is it?
No, it's closed to her because every job that she applied to was like, oh, you're too experienced for this in terms of your qualification.
So again,
but you're not experienced enough in terms of you don't have enough years of experience in a job.
And elements of that experience will be universal, and they were true when I was your age, and they are true now. You've got too much experience, or you haven't got enough experience. How can I get the experience if you won't give me the job where I can get the experience to become experienced enough to get the next job? But do any of these people exist? The graduate educated? I mean, we don't even have to say that. The millions, Keir Starmer said. There's only 900,000 who are qualified as NEETs at the moment in the whole of the UK. But Keir Starmer thinks there's millions of them who want to be doing amazing jobs but can't because they're currently being done by foreign workers. He didn't quite knit it together like that, but it's hard to escape the conclusion that in fact, the Times says that it is a pitch to the kind of people who fall for Farage's shtick, this kind of rhetoric. When he says, I have never thought we should be relaxed about some sectors importing labour when there are millions of young people, ambitious and highly talented, who are desperate to work and contribute to their community. You can only import labour these days if you can prove that you need it and that you can't find it closer to home. And how can there be millions of them if the sum total of young people not in education, employment or training in the first quarter of 2024 for the whole of the United Kingdom was 900,000? Go on, riddle me that. It's 12:31. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's madder. It's such a strange subject, this. No wonder I'm so fascinated by it. Because it gets more confusing all the time, doesn't it? Xavier giving us a fairly neat indication of what is actually happening. It's completely at odds with both what Keir Starmer says is happening and what the people whose approach to immigration is rather more driven by xenophobia or jingoism or racism, whichever one of those bigotries it might be. And then the perfectly reasonable position to say, well, hang on a minute, if there really are millions of young people that can't get jobs because we're giving them all to foreigners, that's not ideal for a whole heap of reasons. And yet, as far as I can tell, none of it's true. If you want to come here on a skilled worker visa, isn't it? It went up, didn't it? It's about 40. It's £38,700 now. So I think it's less. It's about 70% of that if you're very young. If you're under 26 or you're a very recent graduate, but so it can't be underpaying. So what is it? What is going on? And then you add the other element to it, which is the story about young people not really wanting jobs, either anecdotally or statistically, given the research today showing that 27% of companies have had people not turn up on their first day and 41% have had people jacket in after 12 weeks. So how hard is it to find a young person to do your job? Because Keir Starmer says there's millions of them. Something here doesn't smell right. Jeff's in Highgate. Jeff, what would you like to say?
James, hi.
Hello, Jeff.
James,
Jeff.
I'm speaking as a businessman, speaking as, for my sins, the owner of about 9 different companies.
Okay.
And when it comes to interviewing,
yes,
we're interviewing all of the time, and I can only tell you that finding staff since Brexit has been murder. It has been, you're banging your head against a brick wall. And I heard you come up with a percentage a few minutes ago, about 27% of people jacket in after the first day.
No, they don't even turn up, Jeff. They don't even turn up.
Well, you've just, forgive me, not just don't turn up, but 4 out of 5, yeah, you heard correctly, 4 out of 5 applicants for the interviews don't even turn up for the blinking interview.
So you offer them an interview and they don't come for it, and they say yes, and then they don't turn up.
Turn up, full stop. Had you ever asked me this 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said, what are you talking about?
Yes.
But truly, and then you phone them up to find out where they are.
Yes.
And even for a day afterwards, their phones mysteriously have gone blank. I can't give you the answer. We do not
what level of job are you offering? What are we talking? I mean, could these be people who just need to prove to the DWP that they're looking for work and they don't really want to find work and they just need to prove that they've applied for a job in order to keep receiving?
No, James, I wish I could be honest and tell you that.
You sound as baffled as I am, Jeff. You sound as confused as I am, but you're a lot more directly affected by it than I am.
And also, allow me to tell you that when many of them do turn up, we give them a test because it's very important that they have a basic knowledge of maths.
Do you send them to the hardware store to pick up a pot of elbow grease?
Not quite, but what I can tell you is that we give them a
basic maths test,
for 11-year-olds.
Right.
And 20 to 30% of them might get 50% of them right. It's, you're banging your head against a bloody brick wall.
You're very frustrated by this because your business suffers as a direct consequence of not being able to fill posts. Businesses, plural.
James, don't go there.
All right, sorry.
I'm pretty analytical, but when it comes to trying to find staff, they come in one of our businesses. Which is sort of air conditioning and renewable energy based.
Yes.
They come out of college. They do a year's course at a college.
Yeah.
And we ask them the most simple, basic questions that they would have done within the first week. Not a bloody clue. I'm sorry if I sound so frustrated.
Well, no, I think it's incredibly. We're getting all angles. So then, briefly, if you would. Your response to Keir Starmer's insistence that there are millions of young people, ambitious and highly talented and desperate to work and contribute to their community.
Show me 10 of them.
Yeah, all right.
Show me 10 of them. And I must also tell you that I don't know how this is going to come across, but I can tell you that there's no ifs or buts, but our foreign workers, no ifs, no buts, their work ethic, James, is on a different level. Right. They're proud to have a job.
Well, you would. I mean, if I've crossed continents or just the English Channel to in pursuit of advancement, and in either direction, if it's a British person who has gone to Germany looking for work when the economic situations were different, they are probably a little bit more motivated and a little bit more driven than their compadres on the. I don't know. Well, listen, you heard Jeff's voice. 9 businesses. And absolutely no experience whatsoever of the millions of young people that Keir Starmer is talking about, possibly as a very fraudulent attempt to woo the kind of mugs that are persuaded by the rhetoric of King Mug himself. I don't know. I mean, why else? The Times puts it under the little mini headline, pitch to reform, as in pitching to people tempted to vote for that outfit. By lying. Or exaggerating or embellishing or inventing a non-existent problem and attributing it to immigration. The problem is that Keir Starmer has also apparently invested a non-existent cohort of millions of young British people who are desperate to work but can't. Peter is in Manchester. Peter, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'd just like to take issue with these people that are saying that kids don't want to work. So
no, you don't. No one said that. People have described some people. One young man who is working described having some friends who don't want to, and the last fellow is desperately trying to find people to work in his businesses and struggling to do so. But of course, there are young people out there desperate to work. Some of whom may be frustrated and struggling to find work.
Right. Okay. So let's take Mr. Starmer's stance on it, whatever that might be. So, and again, way back before Mr. Starmer. Apprenticeship. So within the Greater Manchester area now, or certainly some weeks ago, in terms of trade apprenticeships, which allegedly were crying out for tradesmen, none. Simple as that, none.
Why not?
So, you tell me.
No, you tell me. I'm in charge. Why not? Neither of us know. None of us know anything. This is like the anti-phone-in. Jeff didn't know any of it. None of us know anything. Nobody knows.
Right. 16-year-old kid leaves school. Bright kid decides uni's not for me. I know this apprenticeship idea everybody's presenting to me.
Right.
Fantastic. Let's go with that. Let's start at college because there's no apprenticeships available, but one will come up. I'll start at college. So he starts at college. Nobody turns up to teach him.
Really?
So he thinks, well, this is really, absolutely, as a given, evidence-based. So he thinks, right, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'm not getting anywhere at college because nobody's turning up to teach me. I'll write to all the local trades guys on Facebook in the local area, see if anybody wants to give me a start.
What's he trying to do?
Right. He started with plumbing.
Right.
Couldn't get a plumbing apprenticeship. So he wrote to everybody in Facebook, "Dear sir, I would like to be a plumber. Please give me a start."
Yeah.
Anyway, a local plasterer said, "I'll give you a start, kid."
Okay.
So he thinks, fantastic, brilliant. Jumps on with this guy, expecting to sign a few apprenticeships. Oh, no, we don't want to do that, kid. We don't want
cash
to
in hand. It's just a bit of cash in hand work, is it?
So, but fair play to him.
Yeah.
For 30 quid a day, the boy jumps on
Wow.
at 5 o'clock in the morning, walks half an hour to his pickup point, gets picked up, does his shift, 8 hours, 10 hours, occasionally 4 hours the Friday afternoon knock, whatever that might be. So he's paying no tax, he's paying no insurance, doesn't exist in the system, and still cannot find an apprenticeship. So where are they?
Well, I don't know whether this is going to be so much smoke up your fundament or whether it is good news on the horizon, but part of the speech that Starmer delivered yesterday involved the announcement of new apprenticeship reforms, foundation apprenticeships created for young people, more flexibilities for businesses to take them on, and pointing out that apprenticeships often went down for entry-level roles, and this might be where the crossover with immigration is relevant. Visa applications for the same skill areas have gone up, so some employers may be hiring people from overseas who have already done some training in preference to taking on an apprentice and having to provide the training himself, in which case I'm comfortable with Keir Starmer pushing that door a little bit more closed, and I think you would be as well. But we'll believe it when we see it.
Yeah, the proof will be in the pudding. Listen, bring as many immigrants to take the apprenticeships, as many British kids, English kids, Scottish kids, bring as many to the front, but get the apprenticeship there.
You can't have it both ways, can you? And there it is. And then we come back to yesterday's phone-in, which you just anointed with an allegedly, which was about the huge shortages in the building trades, in plumbing and plastering and bricklaying and the rest of it, up to 1.3 million more people needed in those trades over the next 10 years, if that research is to be believed. So I mean, in a way, although this all feels incredibly confusing and we're struggling in some ways to find the people that we're talking about, it does feel if you could just sort of mush it all together like Play-Doh, you would come up with a workable system. You could come up with an improvable system. The only thing we're not sure about, Peter's lad notwithstanding, is how many people are actually in this category of because he is what we were looking for, in a way, that young man. He is someone who wants to be doing something but can't. Whether or not, it seems unlikely that the plasterer who's offering him cash in hand work has also got 10 lads from India on the payroll who are on a more official apprenticeship scheme. But there is at least someone there who wants to be contributing to his community and working on the books and currently can't. But millions of them across all sectors? Seems unlikely. 12:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It is time to turn our attention to the Middle East, notably or specifically to the escalating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. We talked yesterday about the difficulties of headlines, which often describe Israel strikes or attacks on Hezbollah. A couple of differences today. The Guardian reports Israeli strikes on southern Lebanon. And when you look at the fact that 569 people, including 50 children, have been killed since the offensive began on Monday morning, another just shy of 2,000 injured, according to the health minister, then the language becomes important, doesn't it? You see, is that an attack on Lebanon or an attack upon Hezbollah? And is the distinction even worthwhile? But we can't concern ourselves with such pedantry at the moment, because Simon Diggins, a defence analyst and a former colonel in the British Army, joins me to address first, Simon, if you would, the role that fatigue and familiarity play. Because if this had started from nothing in the last 72 hours and the UK Prime Minister was mooting the possibility of all-out war in the region, I wonder whether we all would have sat up rather sharper in our chairs. But when it comes after almost a year of conflict in Gaza and the slow incremental increase of missile exchanges between Lebanon and Israel, we don't pay as much attention as we should to the urgency of this situation.
No, good afternoon to you, James. And you're right. I mean, it goes back to almost the Stalin's old line, isn't it? One death is a tragedy. After a while, it just becomes statistics. And that's the danger with war and with fighting. So we have, as you said, we've had a continual fighting now since October the 7th. October the 8th, the first missiles were launched by Hezbollah against Israel, they said, in support of Hamas. And it's been running on from on. So there's been this gradual escalation, then there's been sort of sharp uptick events, like the Pedro attack last week. But as you say, the real danger is that we kind of lose the sense of the horror of what's going on that border between Israel and Lebanon.
And the United Nations meeting today, the Security Council meeting today to discuss the conflict. The international community hasn't been able to do much so far to dial down the violence. Is there any reason to be optimistic that it might suddenly start being able to do so?
No, bluntly, because the one country that has the power to, if you like, to limit Israel and what it's doing is the US, and they will not do so. I think all of us support Israel in its defense against Hamas and responding to the horrors of October 7th. That's not the issue. But there's this issue about whether the alternative, which seems to be just increasing violence, is the answer. And here you have this linkage we've got between the fight in Gaza and what's going on across the Israel-Lebanese border. I mean, Hezbollah have said, and said right from the very beginning, that they wouldn't exchange rockets with Israel if there was a ceasefire. Now, for months, that wasn't even practical an option. But some sort of ceasefire deal has almost been on the table now for nearly 3 months. And every time it gets close, it's stymied. Israel always blames Hamas. A lot of people, including a lot of Israelis, blame Netanyahu because he does not want that war to stop. And so if Israel had no alternative to firing into Lebanon, I think we could see it. But there is an alternative, which is actually to take the path of peace. But only the US can force Israel into that position. And so far, they've been unable so to do.
And, of course, there will be a change of personnel in the White House soon, but we don't know what that change will involve. How much of Netanyahu's focus would be on that, do you think, or is that a silly question?
No, not at all. I think Netanyahu's basically worked out that he's not going to be sufficiently pressured by Biden to give up. American politics is another issue, but sure. I think the influence of Joe Biden and his administration, current administration, is waning fast.
The red lines are in the rearview mirror. The red lines have already been crossed, and therefore they no longer exist.
Yeah, that's probably where it is. I mean, Trump said that he will obviously defend Israel, and I think that's as a broad statement that's there. Whether he'll have any pressure on Netanyahu or just let him carry on, I think is very, very unclear. The danger often is, I think the Republican governments can often be more inclined to support Israel regardless of what they do than the Democratic ones. But it's a fine line between the two.
I mean, Britain now urging its nationals to leave Lebanon. 700 troops being mobilised to Cyprus to help those British citizens evacuate. Joe Biden and Keir Starmer both using the very loaded phrase "full-scale war" as if it is a genuine possibility. In your old job, when you were a colonel in the British Army, would this sound like the beginning of action stations?
I think it is, and I think the precautions that the MOD and others are taking are right. I have just read a report which actually suggests that the FCO is not, the FCDO, Development Office as well.
That's all right.
Is not covering itself in. It's not covering itself in glory. I mean, they stopped their registration of British civilians on September the 11th, which is a long time ago, and long before it looked like this was going to turn into this kind of full-scale war. So there are issues there, but whether we actually know who we are. We had very similar issues in August 21 and not pitching it in Kabul, where some of the FCO officials had to be ordered to stay at their post. So I think if there is going to be a full-scale evacuation, the other report that's coming in is that the line that the British government's peddling at the moment, which is huge commercial flights to get out, isn't working. A lot of those commercial flights are now full. There's very few airlines flying in and out. So I think there needs to be a kind of step change in the British government's approach, if it's required, as it may well be required, to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation out of Lebanon in the midst of fighting. So I'm sure they're doing a lot of precautionary planning at the moment, but the other bit of government machinery to make all that work doesn't appear to be up to standard at the moment.
No, this is no time for sort of grinding your way through the gears. The worst imaginable scenario is official advice to be to get out, and the people who are there can't get out. That's what you're positing, which is what happened in Kabul.
Yeah, and that's what Times has just reported. So I think we've got a problem on our hands.
Listen, I know this is an impossible question to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Full-scale war as a plausibility with this absolutely unignorable element that many people, almost, one might say, almost everybody truly objective, believes that Benjamin Netanyahu's motivation is self-preservation at any cost. The perpetuation of warfare on however many fronts being the only path he can see that keeps him out of court, never mind keeps him in power. How likely then does, and with Iran, of course, being the sponsors of Hezbollah, how likely does this phrase full-scale war feel to you at the moment?
I fear it's a distinct possibility. Right. I wouldn't say necessarily for a
It's happened before. It's happened before.
It's happened before, and I think Israel is aware of what the challenge would be if it decided to conduct a ground invasion of the Lebanese. And there is some evidence that Hezbollah have slightly decided to taunt Israel and select to bring it on, knowing what would happen. But the impact on Lebanon itself, and it's interesting your comment at the beginning about the change in tone, the change in language. I don't think it is pedantry. Actually, the Lebanese ambassador at the beginning of the week to UK made it quite clear that regardless of what they think about Hezbollah, Hezbollah's got a very mixed position in Lebanon. In the event of an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, it will be regarded by Lebanon as an invasion, and the Lebanese army, who we are training, would respond. So here we are in a strange place, but allies of Israel in its legitimate defence requirements, and also train the Lebanese army to be more effective. And we find ourselves on both sides. That's a very uncomfortable position for us to be in.
Yeah, crikey, I didn't know that. Forgive me. That's an extraordinary, that's sort of Joseph Heller territory, isn't it? So we'd be helping. I know that the licenses have been lifted and our contribution was small, but the diplomatic support for Israel remains very strong, and we do help equip them in some ways. And we would also then be, in the event of a quotes full-scale war, end quotes, we'd essentially be helping both sides.
Yeah, I suspect we'd probably remove our soldiers from they were doing the training team bit.
Yeah,
but we are supporting the Lebanese because Lebanon is in itself, and we should never forget Lebanon. It's a deeply fragile, I'd call it a nascent democracy. The Israelis are very keen to say we're the only Western-style democracy in there. I mean, if we were a Western-style democracy like that, then that doesn't impress me at all. But Lebanon is a nascent democracy, very fragile, split on ethno-nationalistic lines, not dissimilar, I suppose, to our own Northern Ireland. We've been trying to help and build up that state as well. The danger of an Israeli invasion, rather like in 2006, a significant amount of Lebanese infrastructure would be destroyed, and Lebanon's fragility might collapse under the pressure as well, which has implications across the entire region.
What would fill the vacuum created? Simon Diggins, many thanks indeed. Defence analyst, former colonel in the British Army, really driving home the seriousness of the situation. And that is it from us for another day. If you missed, not quite, this missing word round. Do you want to hear it? I wonder if Sheila Fogarty can guess what it is. On. Blank people are seen as more physically attractive. We'll fill in the blank.
Blank people are seen as more physically attractive. Tall?
No, because that is a physical attribute. It's a non-physical attribute.
Oh, it's a non-physical attribute.
Yeah, that makes you more physically attractive. I'll spoil it. It's more than being funny or being clever.
Kind.
She's done it. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as Global's live radio stations. Download Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now she's kind, she's clever, she's tall, she's funny.
Oh my God, I've got it all!
It's Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.